Good morning.
Good morning, Jane.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Yeah.
Good. Welcome, everyone. Hi, Counselor Anderson.
Counselor Anderson. I think I go by Tom.
Oh, Tom, excuse me. I forgot.
Yes. When people call me Mr. Anderson, I say, Mr. Anderson, that's my father. Graduate of University of Nebraska.
Oh, that's right. You mentioned that. Small world. Well, how did you all get through the ice storm? Was it bad? Oh,
yes. Three trees fell in our yard, none on the house. I just got back from 4 trips to the drop-off site, but I've got a whole lot of new firewood.
Oh, I'm sorry. 3 on one property. That's a lot.
Jane, you live up on Fairmont Hill, don't you? Did you have problems?
Well, we moved from Fairmont Hill, and so the people that bought our house had enormous problems with all those oak trees.
Yeah.
But I don't think any hit the house, from my understanding. And then we moved out at Illahee, and we had a lot of tree damage. But the house wasn't hurt.
Good, good. So do you know my good friend Bob Jackson? And
I do.
And Gloria, yeah. Bob and I were attorneys together at SAFE for many years, and he is somebody, we have different political views on things. Bob is not afraid of expressing his views, nor am I, but we were best of friends, and he is somebody I would want in a foxhole.
Yeah. Oh, very good. Yeah, that was right behind us on the. We live on St. Andrew's Loop, and he's on the other side of the loop.
Yeah, that's too bad about Gloria. I was out to see Bob before the COVID stuff.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Where is she? I know she's at home.
Yeah, at the one out there on Kubler and I-5.
Oh, Bonaventure?
Yeah, Bonaventure. Yeah.
Very cool. Yep.
Yeah, here's Bob, a helicopter fighter pilot in Vietnam, and here I am, a conscientious objector to Vietnam, but we got along perfectly.
People with different opinions should be able to get along.
Sure, of course we can. Well, and we also each have the same type of personalities, which is helpful too.
Yes, large personalities.
Yeah.
I like the art today, your art selection.
Well, thanks. This is the big one over my left shoulder. Is by an artist named David Trowbridge, who is a Portland artist, and we probably have a dozen of his paintings. Here's another one. You can see that right there.
Yeah, it's very cool.
The one on the top is from an artist named Joe Webster in Cornwall and St. Ives.
Okay.
We have 2 of his, and we communicate with them all the time. We just send an email. And the one on the bottom, we bought at our church at a little art auction.
Oh, very fun.
And there's one up there that is the far one is a John J. Cruson. He's a very well-known artist. Let's see. There's another John J. Cruson. Look in the far wall. There's another one.
Wow. Yeah, you got a lot.
Oh, God. We're going to have to be like a museum and rotate our collection in and out.
Yeah, that's what we had to get rid of so much art when we downsized.
Yeah.
So we gave a lot of it back to the Art Association so they can use it for auctions again. And
cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing your art. It's a nice start to the meeting.
Sorry.
It's everyone started off on the right foot. It's a couple minutes after 9 o'clock, so I'd like to go ahead and welcome everybody to our 3rd task force meeting. And I'd also like to welcome any live stream viewers that we have watching along either now or later in the recorded version. I am Kim Morrow. I'm Director of Climate Planning and Resilience at Veritas Group, and I am the project lead for the project to create the Climate Action Plan for Salem. And I'm here today with my colleagues, Belina Bentledge, who's going to wave, and Kate Hamill, and Brian Harmon. Today, Belina will be serving in our tech support role, so to speak. So if you have any questions or issues with technology, feel free to shoot Belina a message in the chat and she can help you. But I do have good news. This is the first meeting where we will not be using Miro. So there shouldn't be anything complicated technology-wise. We're just doing old school Zoom and slideshows. So I'm going to share my screen and share the agenda with you briefly. So the objective for today's meeting, oops, hold on one second. Let me do that one more time. Oh, best laid plans. Okay, here we go. Okay. So just to remind you of where we are in the process, we have been through a process. First, we started with visioning, and now we're in the second stage of the process, we're in the third stage of the process, which is strategy development. First was visioning, second was climate vulnerability assessment. And the last meeting, we started working on strategies for the climate action plan, and today we're going to continue working on talking about strategies and how to approach the plan. So we have 3 specific objectives for today's workshop. The first is to understand the role of Salem's 3 utilities in meeting the city's greenhouse gas reduction goals. The second is to present Veritas Group's GHG greenhouse gas analysis and discuss its implications to the plan. And then the third objective is to discuss climate equity issues and how they figure into the plan. So you can see the agenda, I believe you can see it on screen. And so you can see how the timing lays out here. Even though we have 3 hours, it will go by quickly and we're gonna have to keep things moving along. We do have Q&A scheduled after each section, so there should be lots of time for discussion, but we will try to stay on time. So once again, we'd ask you to please stay on mute unless you need to speak, but we do invite you to pose questions in the chat anytime you like. When we do have Q&A, specifically Q&A sessions, you know, it worked really well last time for those of you who can use the raise hand function in Zoom to raise your hand to ask a question, and that way we kind of see people lined up and we can call on you in a first come first serve order. So actually, if you want to practice that right now, we may all have slightly different versions of Zoom, so it might be in a different place for you. But for me and my version there, a couple people have it, it's in the reactions button. If you click that button, it brings up a couple of options for you. And one is, it says raise hand. Great, so a lot of people have that. If you can't find it on your version of Zoom, that's okay, just wave like mad or something. You can also access it through the participants window. You can click on the raise hand icon, but we'll call on you either way, so don't worry about that. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce our first agenda item, which is hearing from our 3 electric utilities. As you know, Salem has a goal to reduce emissions 50% by 2035 and to become net zero by 2050. And we know that the transportation and energy sectors are going to be the 2 most important sectors to make big gains in reducing those emissions. And in our last meeting, we talked specifically about the transportation sector and how that figures in. And in this meeting, we'd like to talk specifically about the energy sector. So we are very pleased to have 3 speakers today from each of Salem's energy utilities who are going to speak with us about the plans they have to reduce emissions and play an important part in meeting Salem's GHG reduction goals. So with us this morning, we have Alicia Trainer. If you want to wave, Alicia, she is the Manager of Environmental Policy at PGE. Secondly, we have Brittany Davidson Cruikshank. If you want to wave, Brittany. She is the Member Services Manager at Salem Electric. And finally, we have Connor Wrighton, is the Government Affairs Manager for Northwest Natural. Connor, if you want to wave, there he is, great. So each of these speakers will have 10 minutes to speak, and we'll be showing a brief slide deck for each of them. We would ask you to please hold your questions until the end. We're going to let them go back to back, 3 in a row, and then we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A at the end. So please hold your questions until the end. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Alicia to tell us about what's going on at PGE.
Quick question, are you going to be displaying my slides?
Yes, Belina is going to be running your
Perfect. I see it now.
whenever you want to advance.
Perfect. Good morning, Climate Action Task Force members. My name is Alicia Trainer, and I'm the Environmental Policy Manager for Portland General Electric. Today, I'm going to discuss our climate action goals and some of our big decarbonization actions that we have taken recently to meet these goals. I'm happy to be here with you today. But before I begin, I just want to recognize that the last couple weeks have been challenging for many of our customers. And I just want to give my sincere thanks to our customers throughout the recent storms. Next slide. Perfect. So PG is proud to be Oregon's largest electricity provider, serving about 50% of the state's population and 75% of its commercial and industrial activity. We operate in 10 counties in Oregon, which includes 15 different generation plants across the state and 11 community parks that surround our hydro facility. We also have one generation facility in Washington state and one in Montana. PGE is proud to be an Oregon headquartered employee. We have about 3,000 employees, plus we also employ about 1,000 contractors. We provide family wage jobs in the state, and we have employees or retirees living in about 30 counties in Oregon. We are the largest taxpayer in most of those counties that we have generation, and we are in the top 5 taxpayers for counties where we have customers. We're also committed to the communities that we serve in Oregon. Our employees give about 45,000 hours per year in volunteer time to local nonprofits. And together with PGE employees and the PGE Foundation, we give about $3.5 million per year to local schools in the communities. In addition to all that, we also have the largest voluntary renewable program in the country. That's pretty impressive for a pretty small to mid-size electric utility, but it positively represents the customers that we serve. Next slide. So the energy landscape that a utility operates in is rapidly changing. Traditionally, our customers have really wanted us to focus on safe, affordable, and reliable power. That's kind of the base of what an electric utility does. But today, our customers also expect clean and increasingly carbon-free power, and also increasingly equitable power. So we've heard our customers loud and clear. And we have recently updated our goals to help be a partner to the state and the community. Okay, next slide. So we recently reviewed our greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals that we released back about 3 years ago. And we recognized that we needed to update those targets to reflect the urgency in climate change and also to meet our customers' desire to be served with increasingly clean and renewable power. So we heard our customers loud and clear. And we too want to operate a more sustainable, electricity system. So therefore, our new targets, which are displayed on this slide, are to reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with the power that we serve customers by at least 80% by below 2010 levels by 2030. That bumps up that prior goal that we set about 3 years ago by 20 years. In addition to that, we also set a new aspirational goal of 0 greenhouse gas emissions associated with the power that we serve customers by 2040. This goal is categorized as aspirational because we are going to need regulatory, technology, and policy changes to fully eliminate emissions from our power supply. And last but certainly not least, to address the greenhouse gas emissions associated with our internal operations, we've also set a net zero goal. And that really covers the vehicles we drive, the materials we purchase, how we power our buildings. It's really how we're walking our talk. So we are super excited about these new goals, and along the way, we are going to continue to keep that safe, affordable, and reliable power as we reach these goals. And we're confident working with our customers and our communities like the city of Salem, we can reduce emissions together and build this future together. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk about kind of some of the recent examples of how we're going to meet these large greenhouse gas reduction goal and really keying in on those power supply goals. So first is our Wheat Ridge Energy Facility. This is the first in its nation combined facility that has wind, solar, and battery storage at one single location. This is going to be an 380 megawatt facility. It's going to be one of the largest solar farms in Oregon, and it will be the largest battery storage facility located in Oregon. And it is in Morrow County. And right now, the wind portion of that facility is up and running, and we're hoping that the solar and the battery storage portion of that facility will be up and running by the end of this year or early in 2022. Next slide. So in addition, we're bringing on new customer-enabled renewable resources, and this is through our Green Future Impact Program. And Wendy will get into this a little bit later, but City of Salem is one of our Green Future Impact customers. So through this Green Future Impact Program, we are bringing online 2 of Oregon's largest solar farms that will be on later this year or early next year. The output of one of these solar facilities, which will be about 160 megawatts, will be dedicated to 18 of our largest customers so they can meet their own sustainability, clean electricity, and climate action goals. The second facility, which is about 138 megawatt solar facility, is going to be dedicated to one customer, our largest customer, Intel. So through this program and with these facilities, it's a win-win for our participating customers and for PGE because they provide grid benefits to us and they also support the regional green economy. And we're looking forward to expanding this program to meet future customer needs. Next slide. So in addition to these large decarbonization actions I was talking about in the previous slide, bringing on these large renewable facilities, we're also partnering with our customers to realize this future. And this slide has a lot of information on it. So first off, sorry about that. But really what it highlights is our customer programs that we are developing, customer transportation electrification programs, and customer-sited generation and storage projects. This all helps an electric utility and the smart grid of the future, but it also helps our customers reach their sustainability and climate action goals. So we can spend an entire presentation on these kind of customer programs, but I just really wanted to flag these for you today since we have limited time. And please feel free to reach out to Wendy or myself if you'd like to learn about any of these programs that on this slide. But now I'm going to hand it over to Wendy, who's going to discuss the great partnership that we've had with the City of Salem. Wendy?
Couldn't find my mute. Hi, Wendy Valise. I'm one of the, I work at PGE and I'm one of the Climate Action Task Force members. So I want to just go over a few of the things that we've been doing. We have a history working with the City of Salem and your leadership. We've been serving the community for 130 years. Our work started many years ago, and an example of that is the Salem Community Energy Plan that was adopted in 2009. And PGE was amongst many partners that included Energy Trust of Oregon, Willamette University, that really helped develop that plan with short and long-term goals. That plan was really focused on energy efficiency and conservation and education. And from that really launched some of the other opportunities that we've worked with the city going forward. Last year, we completed the Salem Electric Avenue, and that is 4 charging stations, 2 fast charging and 2, I don't remember how the term you used, but we have 4 charging stations capital that PGE fully funded and worked with the city on an agreement to have those charging stations located at the city, with the city and in partnership with the state capitol as well. Alicia touched on this earlier. We have a renewable development plan, a renewable development fund, and that fund is our customers who pay extra for supporting renewable projects. And we have funded many projects in the Salem area. The largest grant that we've made was for the Willow Lake Cogeneration Facility upgrade. We made a $3 million contribution grant to that project, that upgrade that's going to take the energy from that facility and create energy, which is going to lower your cost and lower the energy need. We have several other examples of renewable development funds. Recently, we provided a grant to the Open Door Churches for solar projects, the Temple Beth as well for solar. And then also Chemeketa Community College has a solar project that we just provided a grant. So we've probably been close to $4 million in Salem through that fund, through our customers. And then the last item, also Alicia touched on this as well, is City of Salem is one of a handful of local governments that signed on to be a Green Future Impact subscriber. That was a 15-year agreement to purchase local power. It's actually coming from Gillum County to help energize city facilities. And so with, I think Councillor Anderson asked if you were one of the 18. You are one of the 18s and you approved that. City Council, thank you for your support. You approved that agreement early in 2020 before the pandemic. So it probably seems very, very far away, but City of Salem, along with a handful of the other local governments, were subscribers. And because they signed on to those agreements, that solar project in Gillum County is being built, and we hope will be coming online. I believe, Alicia, is that next year, early next year?
It's end of this year or early next year.
Yeah. So we're really pleased with the partnerships that we've had with the City of Salem and some of the work, just to kind of highlight a few items. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Alicia. Sorry, I mispronounced it in the beginning. Alicia and Wendy, thank you very much.
It's okay.
That was
I'm
super
used to it.
brief, but appreciate you keeping close to our 10-minute time limit. And so now I'd like to turn it over to Brittany to speak about Salem Electric.
Yes. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. My name is Brittany Davidson. I'm the Member Services Manager at Salem Electric. If you could go to the next slide, please. Before I get started, I just would like to say a little bit about who we are because a lot of you may not know. Salem Electric is a small member-owned cooperative serving about 17.5 square miles in West Salem, Kaiser, and Northeast Salem. As a member-owned cooperative or consumer-owned utility, we are a democratic organization guided by our members who actively participate in setting policies, making decisions, and co-op elections. Next month, we will be celebrating our 80th anniversary. So, next slide, please. Salem Electric is a full requirements customer of the Bonneville Power Administration, meaning we purchase all of our power from the Bonneville Power Administration, and Salem Electric is a distribution utility, meaning we purchase the power from Bonneville, they send it to us, and then we distribute it to our members. Over 90% of the power that we purchase is generated by clean renewable hydropower from Northwest dams. The dams not only provide a lot of energy, they also provide that energy with no greenhouse gas emissions, something that is special to the Northwest, unlike other parts of the country. In total, 95% of the power that we purchase from BPA comes from renewable resources. Next slide, please. To encourage renewable technology, we offer member incentives for installing photovoltaic or rooftop solar systems and residential electric vehicle chargers. We currently have 78 PV installations on our system and 10 more. So that program is continuing to grow. By state law, we're required to purchase up to 0.5% of our power from alternative resources. However, our board recently voted to double that. So setting the benchmark at 912 kW, twice what we're required to take on. And then recently, in an effort to promote electric vehicles and the benefits of an electric vehicle, we began offering a member incentive for home chargers. Once our members participate in the program, we're able to monitor their charging data so that we can start to learn a little bit more about what their habits are. looking down the road at time of use, ways to offset peak demands during the day. Next slide. One of Salem Electric's longtime goals is to be a good steward of our natural resources and limit the need to build additional substations. So we also offer a variety of programs for members looking to improve the efficiency of their home or business. One example would be our heat pump program, where we would give members an incentive to switch from oil heat to electric heat, essentially switching to a cleaner fuel. Next slide, please. Looking ahead, we will continue to promote programs that encourage renewable resources, reduce carbon emissions, and educate our members about how to use energy efficiently and wisely. Internally, we've begun discussions about how to electrify our fleet and make building improvements that could reduce our carbon footprint. We're actually quite polar opposite of PGE because we are very small and we don't have our own generation. So what we can do is limited. However, being able to purchase our power from Bonneville and having the very low carbon emissions, we feel very confident moving into the future that that we will continue to get greener here at Salem Electric too. So thank you. That's all that I have today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brittany. And next we have Connor from Northwest Natural Lab.
Yeah, thank you, Kim, and thank you for the opportunity to present. This is something that we refer to as our low carbon pathway. And I'm really excited to share this and have a conversation around it. But first, for those who might not be familiar with us, Northwest Natural is a natural gas utility that serves over 770,000 customers in the Western Oregon and Southwest Washington area. Here in Salem specifically, we serve 36,000 homes, 3,300 businesses, about 225 government facilities, 150 educational facilities, and 300 healthcare facilities. We're the second oldest company operating in the state of Oregon, and we've been serving the community since 1859. One thing that has allowed Northwest Natural to stay in business for so long has been our ability to shift and change with the times in order to fit the needs of our customers. And this discussion today really centers around how Northwest Natural will continue to shift our core offerings in order to meet the climate imperative and serve our community into the future. So Northwest Natural has committed to carbon neutrality by 2050, and I have a few slides to detail how we intend to get there. However, I want to leave as much time for questions and conversation as possible. In our last couple of meetings, I have heard some skepticism about the ability of a natural gas utility to be a part of the climate solution. I'm here to share our plans, but I really want to answer questions and work towards the collaborative approach that we need to meet the challenges that we face here as a community. I truly believe that we can meet our climate goals. In order to get there, we're going to have to optimize our resources and take advantage of the best technology that exists today and continue to develop technologies to move us in the right direction. So if we can move on to the first slide, as a utility, we have a lot of priorities that we have to balance on behalf of our customers. Safety, reliability, affordability, and environmental responsibility are all values that drive our day-to-day work. And the key for us to meet our climate goals and support a decarbonized economy and get there in a way that doesn't leave behind any of our customers, because 33% of our customers are low income across our service territory. So here on our second slide, if we can move there, I want to talk a little bit about where we start as a utility. Northwest Natural heats 74% of the residential square footage in the areas that we serve. And on the coldest days of the year, we provide 90% of the energy going into homes with natural gas, space, and water heating. So we provide a lot of energy. And as for our emissions, we can see the direct use of natural gas accounts for about 12% of Oregon's GHG emissions. And half of that comes from Northwest Natural customers who collectively make up about 6% of the pie. While we feel the efficiency of natural gas has played a significant role in reducing emissions in the United States over the past couple of decades, we know that we have to do better in order for that to continue to be the case. We're going to continue to meet that challenge by changing the product that we deliver to our customers. And this is not the first time. Could we move to slide 2, please? Or slide 3, yeah. This is not the first time we've had to make this type of transition. After serving the Oregon community for about 90 years, Northwest Natural moved away from what was referred to as manufactured gas to what was then and now known as natural gas. We plan on making a similar transition over time to the next generation of clean energy, and much of the groundwork has been laid for this type of transition through changes in our rate-making model in a way that incentivizes us to reduce our customer gas use through the modernization of our delivery system, and et cetera. Next slide, please. So we essentially have three parts to our plan here. The integration of renewable natural gas onto our system is a significant one. And renewable natural gas, for those who might not be familiar, is essentially just a closing of the waste loop on organic waste streams. So it substantially reduces carbon dioxide emissions and can directly be used. It's essentially interchangeable with natural gas. So we can get this from wastewater treatment facilities, municipal solid waste, landfills, dairies, and wood and agricultural residues. If we could go to the next slide, please. And the second piece of this, which is really exciting, is the integration of green hydrogen onto our system. So what we can do is we can essentially, well, let's back up here. As many of us know, electricity cannot be stored. Once it's generated, it has to be very quickly consumed. And the balancing of generation from moment to moment need is one of the confounding problems between us and decarbonization. In areas of the country that have quickly added wind and solar generation, they've run into what they refer to as a duck curve problem. And this is when generation peaks in the early afternoon while consumption tends to be down at the same time. And then generation reduces in the late afternoon into the evening when use spikes. And green hydrogen is the concept of taking electricity during the peak renewable production time and running it through an electrolysis process and turning it into hydrogen, which can be directly injected into our system and blended directly with the natural gas. So in effect, this allows us to partner with electric utilities to use the natural gas system as an energy storage asset while reducing the carbon content of the natural gas that we deliver to our system. One of the things that we looked at is our underground storage facilities of natural gas, where, you know, on the coldest days we withdraw storage in order to meet our customer needs. If you actually take the energy value that we can store in that one location and translated that into lithium-ion batteries, you can essentially say that we have a $2 trillion lithium-ion battery at our disposal through electrolysis like this. So next slide, please. Yeah. And then the last of these top-line strategies is, of course, energy efficiency. By providing the same energy value to our customers with less gas, we can lower our carbon footprint while lowering energy bills for our customers. And I'll move on to the next slide, please. So this is an illustration of our vision for the future of the natural gas system. One thing you will notice is that much of the energy consumed in the community is produced right there in the same community. So in addition to getting us to carbon neutrality, the system will allow Northwest Natural to be even better when it comes to energy resilience in the future. So again, I wanted to leave as much time as I can for conversation, so I'm just gonna let us move directly into the Q&A section, and I see that we've got some questions coming in already.
Okay, great. Thank you, Connor. I appreciate you leaving time for discussion. That's always a nice way for all of us to learn, so good idea there. There are a lot of questions in the chat, and some of those are being answered, thank you, by the utility representatives. So I think I'll just set that aside for now and look at raised hands. And John has his hand raised first. So John.
So Alicia, I got a question for you. I know you're working with different communities on a municipal green energy rate, and there's also a bill in the legislature. Could you describe that rate?
Yeah, happy to. So as I mentioned in the presentation, we serve about 50% of the state's population, and a lot of that is the Portland metro area. So we have 5 local governments that have climate action plans that have 100% clean and renewable electricity goals in the 2030 to 2035 range. And so those aren't just for local government building, that's for the entire community, all the residential, all the commercial, and all the industrial within that local government's kind of boundary. So we have been in conversations with those local governments for a little over a year now. Some have progressed farther than others just based on competing priorities about how can we partner with that local government. And I will use the city of Milwaukee as an example. how can we partner with them to create a community-wide green energy product that would allow all the residents and commercial buildings within the boundaries of the city of Milwaukee to be opted into this program. And so it helps them meet their climate action goals. It helps us as a utility because it has the potential to bring on new renewable resources. So right now we're working through the PUC Public Utility Commission had a kind of kickoff workshop on that product, or on that process, I guess I should say, on Monday. So there was a 3-hour workshop on that on Monday. And also we have introduced some enabling legislation into the 2021 legislative session to help give that clear authority to the Public Utility Commission to approve such a program. So it's still pretty early in development and in discussions, but it's a really exciting project to work with our local governments who have these aggressive climate action goals, to partner with them and their communities to help them reach their goals. Does that help, John? Perfect. And happy to answer any other questions there.
Can you just explain what the product would be? Like,
it's really early on, so there is no product yet, so I can't explain what it is. We're very early on in it, but it would be an ability for the residential and commercial customers within those cities to opt in or to opt out, or to have the city opt those customers into a program that would build up to their climate goals. So let's say City of Milwaukee as an example, they have 100% clean and renewable community-wide electricity goal by 2030. So to build up, so it would use our base mix, PGE's base mix. We already have, as in my presentation, we already have a solid base mix of carbon-free resources, but to advance the members of those communities to reach their climate action goals, because they're ahead of our own climate change goals. So it'd be there'd be additional new resources to meet those cities' goals.
Okay, great.
And so I don't have it's so early on, I don't have we haven't gotten to like detailed product design with any community yet.
Well, thanks for explaining that concept.
But any design would protect low-income customers.
Yep, that's actually in our legislation. It basically calls that out, that during this product design, that low-income customers need to be held harmless through this process. Yes. Yep.
Thank you, Alicia. That's an interesting idea that maybe the city of Salem could consider also. So yep. Thank you.
We'd be happy to talk more about that.
Great. Again, if you have questions, if you could raise your hand, that would be great. It looks like several of the questions are being answered in the chat. So thank you again for those. John, looks like you had a second question.
Yeah, just quick follow-up. Are there any other customers in Salem who would be eligible for the Green Future Impact once it's expanded?
Yeah, so the Green Future Impact Program would be available for any customer that has greater than 30 kW kilowatt hours. And that usually is, residential customers would be below that. Small commercial, which would be like your local coffee shop, would be below that. But a lot of other larger commercial facilities, industrial facilities would be over that threshold. Sorry, that's kind of a wonky, the 30 kW, that's kind of a wonky utility term. But yes, there would be other manufacturing, large commercial, industrial type facilities that could be available for Green Future Impact, assuming we get approval for our additional, to continue to grow that program.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And Tom, you have a question?
Why, yes, I do. This is for Connor, and we discussed this a little bit in past meetings, Connor. I'm looking at the other two utilities who are generating most of their power from electricity, as opposed to, like, I know PGE just got rid of their coal plant in was not purchasing stuff from Boardman. And I appreciate and applaud all the efforts Northwest Natural is doing to try to keep it kind of a closed system. But in the end, isn't there something, aren't you, no matter what you do by burning the natural gas, aren't you emitting more greenhouse gases into the system? No matter how you try to say we're going to capture methane, we're going to do this, we're going to do that.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it sort of gets into the attribution of emissions at a certain point. But so when we talk about being carbon neutral, if we're taking emissions that are happening elsewhere and that are continuing to happen elsewhere, and we're using that as a usable energy source, then in some cases we're actually doing better than it would have been before by taking methane that was just being released by some of these processes and actually combusting it down into carbon dioxide. In other cases, we're taking methane that has been combusted elsewhere and just combusting it for usable energy. So we're sort of taking over some of the emissions from some of these other areas that are already happening. And then the other areas like hydrogen, it really depends on the carbon emissions of the electricity that we use to create the hydrogen.
Well, I guess my ultimate question is, even though you're doing all these things, you still end up, even if you're capturing methane and you're capturing all this other stuff, aren't you still ending up emitting greenhouse gas into the environment? That's my question.
Yeah. So if we
understand it's a much lower level than it could be, but you're still doing that.
Yeah. So if you could imagine a future where all of these waste methane processes no longer exist, so there's no longer wastewater treatment facilities, there's no longer landfills, there's no longer any of those things. Let's say that none of that is available. In that case, our plan would have to shift entirely towards green hydrogen.
And what's green hydrogen?
Green hydrogen is hydrogen that's created from excess renewable electricity in the middle of the day and injected into a system. In this case, we would have a dedicated hydrogen system.
Thank you. I do, if I can just ask one other question, because many people have raised this to me. And I'm speaking as someone who has a gas stove, and it's wonderful. My wife is a gourmet cook, and so it's perfect to get back and forth. But several people have raised to me the health concerns of, even with a fan, which we have, the natural gas into the home. I wonder if you could comment on that a bit. Thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. That is something that we've started to hear recently as well, and it's really serious. We want to make sure that all of our customers are healthy, and as we know, the process of cooking food releases particulates, and so you have to make sure that you have ventilation in your home. As for the whether it's natural gas versus an electric cooktop, there have been a couple of studies recently that have shown some concern about exposure directly to the natural gas itself. Those studies, specifically one that's come out of UCLA recently, essentially studied what would happen if you were exposed at high levels with no ventilation directly to natural gas or to methane directly. What it didn't do is collect any data from actual homes that have natural gas cooktops versus electric cooktops. But there is another study that has done that. They collected 250,000 data samples in 47 countries around the world that compared asthma rates from asthma and other respiratory issues from natural gas cooktop homes and electric cooktop homes, and found that there was no correlation. So that's something that's certainly very serious, and we want to make sure that all of our customers are healthy. And so we always encourage that they have ventilation regardless of what cooktop they're using. But even some of these other studies have shown that the highest air quality concern inside a home with regards to cooking is actually comes from a toaster.
Interesting. Okay, Janet, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to give a little context to this, since I'm the 350 Salem representative here on the task force. There's been a lot of greenwashing on natural gas as a bridge product, and it's not. It's not a bridge product. It's not clean. It's not natural, and we need to, kind of deal with that new data, because in 2018 we kind of developed new ways of measuring methane leak rates. So we could use satellites, we could use drones. It was really cool. You can look up the pictures if you Google it. And so we know, and we have the studies that show that the methane leak rate at the beginning of kind of fracking means that natural gas is as bad as coal or worse than coal. So this idea of it being a cleaner fuel than coal, it's not. So we need to kind of set aside those old ideas and those kind of advertising induced ideas and deal with the reality. I also wanted people to know that the Public Utility Commission, the PUC, has opened a docket on the future of gas in Oregon. So what they're doing right now is collecting data to look at the emission levels and to look at the possibility that this path that Northwest Natural and other companies are presenting is actually, kind of accurate and feasible. And so we'll have that information sometime in the future.
Yeah, I'd love to respond to that if I could. And I appreciate that, Janet. I think that there has been this concept of natural gas as a bridge fuel over time. So there's a couple of pieces to it. But, one thing that we as a company are really embracing is the fact that there is a climate imperative. And even if natural gas was an effective bridge fuel for a period of time because of its own emissions statistics or whatever you want to call it, we know that that is not going to cut it into the future. If we just continue to serve the same product that we've always been serving, we are not going to be a part of the climate solution. We recognize that piece. So, when we're talking about a bridge fuel, we're talking about moving to an entirely different kind of fuel and serving our customers in a different kind of way. So we are going towards carbon neutrality. We have completely separate ideas based on how we source our gas and all those things. As for upstream emissions issues, you're right. There has been new technology that has come online that it allows us to look at how carbon intensive our product is along the line. And the group that has been integrating all of these new technologies and has been putting out statistics around this over the last 30 years has been the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States. So I know that there is some concern that they're not getting all of it, but they have done a really nice job over time of integrating all of these new technologies. And I would actually say that for us in the Pacific Northwest, where we are actually getting our gas in British Columbia, we actually have replaced all of our bare steel cast iron piping, and we've really looked at how we can reduce the amount of emissions we have in process of delivering it to our customers. And we're the first utility in the United States that's completely moved all of our pipe over to the coated PVC that's more flexible and it is a tighter seal. So we actually feel that if you look at the United States as a whole and you create all of this upstream emissions data, we in the Pacific Northwest and specifically in Northwest Natural's territory would certainly be on the lowest end of the spectrum compared to other gas utilities around the country. Did I get all the concerns and questions there?
Thank you for your response, Connor. That was really helpful. We have time for one last question, and so I'm going to turn it over to John.
Connor, one of your elements is energy efficiency. We've been primarily talking supply side. You have very precise, very large numbers of 46 to 66% reduction. Have you worked with the Energy Trust to create a plan? Number one, and do you have community level plans for energy efficiency, for meeting your energy efficiency goals?
Yeah, that's a great question, John. And so the answer to the question is yes, and not quite yet. We have worked with some communities, and this is exactly why we want to be a part of these types of plans, is we want to create community level plans for the city of Salem. So we are working with Hood River and Portland and Milwaukee and all these different cities. But we have not done that in each one of our jurisdictions. And I was speaking just yesterday with a community action CAP agency in a different city, and that's something that we're having to do city by city. But we are working very closely with the ETO to make sure that we have a service territory wide program that helps us get to the goals that we've set out.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. That was really interesting to hear from all three utilities. We will go through the questions that have been posed in the chat, and if anything has not been answered, we'll make sure to send those out to the utilities and get an answer for you.
Hey, Kim,
But with
can I answer one more question here that I just got in the chat here about renewable natural gas just before we finish here?
Sure.
I've actually seen a lot of this around about whether there's enough renewable natural gas to actually serve our company. I think I saw on Twitter that our CEO had gone out and said there was enough renewable natural gas to take care of all of Northwest Natural's residential customers. And there was a lot of skepticism around that. I think somebody had said that there's enough renewable natural gas supply in the state right now to cover about 20% of the natural gas that is actually used in the state of Oregon. But all of the residential customers that we have in the state of Oregon, not just Northwest Natural, but Avista and Cascade as well, use about 16.5% of the natural gas that's used in the state. Our commercial customers make up another about 11%. So, I have seen a number of concerns that say, hey, if only 20%, you guys must use all of the gas that come into the state. All utility customers make up about, what would that be? About 27% of the natural gas used in the state, gas direct use utilities. So thank you for that question, John.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're going to switch gears now, and I think this is something you're going to be really interested in. Veritas Group, specifically my colleague Brian, has been hard at work since we met last time, doing a lot of in-depth analysis of what it would take to meet the City of Salem's greenhouse gas reduction goals. And so today he is presenting the results of his analysis, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Brian. Take it away.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks to the speakers from the utilities. I know that was really interesting for me to listen to. So let's go ahead and dive in. So what I want to make sure we talk about today are Salem's greenhouse gas emission projections, and make sure I can get us set up here. We're going to really break that into a couple different pieces here. We're going to talk about some baselining forecasts. And so that's really a question of from where are we measuring our emissions? And I say that because when we typically think about baselining, we think about baselining as an activity about the past, right? We might look at, like, for example, setting a baseline from 2016 and then measuring forward. And the challenge with the types of forecasts that we're doing is that we really need to be able to measure a reduction into the future. So we need a baseline about what 2050 is going to look like so we can understand how we're measuring your impact on 2050. So we'll spend some time there and dive in a little bit more about what that means. Then we're going to look at some target scenario projections. So that's basically asking, okay, so now that we've set this baseline, where are we going to reduce our emissions down to under some different scenarios? And I want to just bring up the context piece that I think is critical throughout, which is that Salem has two goals that we're going to be tracking on the target scenario projections. And so that's a 50% reduction from 2016 by 2035 and 100% reduction by 2050. And so that's where we'll keep coming back to, because those are critical pieces of information in regards to how well you're doing under these different modeling exercises. Okay, so diving into the forecasts. So I'm going to spew out a kind of the defense up front of making sure we all understand what these are. These are, as I mentioned, baselines. So we're going to provide three different baselines as the context of where the future looks like if you were to take no additional action from what you're doing today. What that means is that none of these futures are the future we're going to be in, because we know that Salem's going to be taking action from their climate action plan. And so this is where we're starting from, not where we're actually going to be, or where we as Veritas Group feel Salem would be in 2035 or 2050. And it's really critical to realize that the further out we go into the future, the more uncertain things become. So it's the classic, we have the knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. And by the time we get out to 2050, there's a lot of variability, and that's because we simply don't know what 30 years down the road looks like. The person who figures that out ought to buy a whole bunch of lottery tickets. So that's a little bit about what these are and are not. It's also critical to understand that we want to create an informed range of baselines that take into account really actionable steps. So for example, with the United States rejoining the Paris Agreement, we wouldn't just assume that we're going to have an 80% reduction, because those actions take place at state and local levels. Same thing with the state of Oregon's goals. We don't just assume that those actions take place. There needs to be strategies, specific actions, et cetera. So we can get a little bit more into that as we go through that, about what's included in these. And we have 3 forecasts. And I think from their names, you'll have a pretty good idea of what they might project. So we've got a pessimistic, a mid-range, and an optimistic forecast. And we'll go through them in that order. And again, the intent is just to show you where you would be if you didn't take action, so that when we get to the second half of this presentation, we know where to measure from. So we'll dive in and show you the pessimistic forecast. So way over on the left of this graph, 2016, that is your greenhouse gas inventory. So that's the data. And you can see these different pieces of the bar are the different categories from which your greenhouse gas emissions come from. So in 2016, as you well know from earlier presentations, more than half of your emissions come from transportation. Most of the rest comes from residential energy and commercial energy use. And then you've got this small sliver at the top that's related to wastewater and waste, okay? Now, as we project forward into the future, this is probably the closest we come to what you would think of as like a business as usual forecast, which really means that this is kind of the most pessimistic of the realm of what's possible, at least in our opinion. And this would lead by 2050 to a 31% increase in net greenhouse gas emissions. So clearly not where you're going to want to end up, right? And in particular, you can see that although there are some pieces of this pie or this area graph that are shrinking through time, particularly around electricity, you can see that things like transportation continue to grow. And that's because as we get into these details here, you're adding more people into Salem. And if we aren't offsetting that in some other way, then your emissions are going to go up. So let's talk about what's occurring, or some of the kind of broad level assumptions that are going into this forecast. So with all 3 forecasts, we assume the same population growth rate, which is based off of Portland State University's projections. So we're assuming that Salem continues to grow and you add more people. In terms of the mobile assumptions that are really critical, we assume that there's no mile per gallon improvement of on-road vehicles. And that might seem fairly extreme, and it probably is. It's fair to note that from 1990 to today, or at least a few years back from today, that the average on-road American vehicle only improved by about 3 miles per gallon. And that's because even though the vehicles being sold have improved on a mile per gallon rate, A, vehicles that are on the road last for a long time, and B, much of that time period, gas has been relatively inexpensive. And the classic American consumer behavior is that when gas is cheap, people buy SUVs. And even though SUV mile per gallon rates have improved, they're significantly lower than kind of the highest quality vehicles. So that's just to say that might seem a little bit crazy that in 2050, we'd still have MPG vehicles that are the same as today. But over the last 30 years, that's really about where we've been. So it's kind of a continuation of our current policies. We assume that the EV adoption rate continues at the current levels, which is around 3% of vehicles being purchased are EVs. And we assume no technological improvement in your bigger, heavier trucks like your semi-trucks, for example. In terms of electricity, we assume Salem Electric continues to purchase from BPA. We used PG&E's older 2019 reference goals, so not their new 2040 net zero goals. And we assumed that natural gas just grows with population. So again, kind of the realms of leaving what's possible, but kind of the upper bounds of the worst case scenario, in our opinion. So putting that in context of where Oregon is, you can see from 1990 to 2020, as a whole, the state's emissions have actually increased rather than decreased. And in particular, I wanted to draw your eye down to the bottom of this graph, which is the transportation. And you'll note that actually the projection from 2020 to 2050 at the state level here, if you kind of continued with your current policies, shows a very similar relationship to what we modeled, which is a small increase in transportation emissions, which is absolutely the wrong way to be going in regards to both your goals and the state's goals. So diving into the next of our 3 forecasts, you'll see this, what we're calling the mid-range baseline forecast. Here we see a 38% net reduction by 2050. What you really see here that's dramatically different is transportation emissions declining, and you're really kind of peaking now, so to speak, in 2020 through 2023, and then you're going to start this decline in this forecast. So what's changed about the assumptions? Well, we assumed a annualized MPG improvement rate that would be in line with what the Obama era regulations were for vehicle MPG improvements into the future. We continued to assume a relatively low Eevee rate. And then we also assumed annualized MPG improvement in heavy vehicles that we took from the Oregon Transportation Plan. And I'm messing up the name there, but anyways, we took their table of improvements and factored that in. We also assumed that PG&E achieves their 2040 net zero goal, and we just made the same assumption here with natural gas grows with population rate, okay? Shifting into the most optimistic of the 3 is a 44% reduction in 2016 by 2050. So again, this is the context of essentially the best case scenario that we've modeled is if Salem was not proactive and didn't tackle emissions via their climate action plan, this is sort of the best case scenario of where you could end up, which is a 44% reduction. So this means there are lots of other things in the world that are happening, you're just not really contributing any extra to them. So what's included in here? Well, we've assumed sort of a more optimistic EV adoption rate that's in line with kind of current expectations about where EVs will go. We also assumed that Northwest Natural will have that 20% energy efficiency improvement. And we'll talk more, one of our, when we get into the planning exercise here, we do assume also there's, we show you what the 47% energy improvement looks like, or energy efficiency improvement looks like. But we decided to include a portion of that as sort of baked in, and a portion of that as would require active participation by Salem. So that's the assumptions at a high level that are going into this model. So combining that, what do we end up with? Well, at the far end of the worst case scenario, we're telling you that maybe your emissions would be 31% higher than they are today. And at the better end, we're saying that they're 44% lower. I think this is the context piece. The pessimistic one, I would argue, from, and I kind of smile as what I believe I'm a pessimistic person. I don't think that's particularly likely to be where you will be. And that's because there are a lot of assumptions that have to occur for you to go 31% higher than you are today. On the flip side of that, I think that there are a lot of things that we can't put in the optimistic baseline forecast because, to be frank, it would be making things up. So if you thought about somebody trying to go through this exercise 30 years ago, they wouldn't assume that by 2040 or 2050, most people are driving or at least purchasing electric vehicles. And that's something we can include today. And so there are just technological innovations and breakthroughs, new ideas, et cetera, that are going to occur before 2050 that will help you regardless of whether you take action on them or not. And we can't include those because they don't exist yet. So your pessimistic is probably about as pessimistic as is realistically possible. And your optimistic is probably not as optimistic as what is possible. It's just the most optimistic we can show you. So putting that again in context of Oregon's goal as a whole, or Oregon's projection and goal as a whole, if we take a 31% increase and a 44% decrease, what we're really saying is that if you were to try to just assume that the average, and there's really no average there, but if you were to assume the average point between those two, it'd be a small decrease out to 2050. So when we look at Oregon's projection as a whole, where do you end up? Well, you end up about where you started in 1990. So a fairly similar mean, so to speak, as what we're forecasting as well. All right, so we're going to jump into the target scenario projections. And this is really saying if Salem were to meet certain thresholds, where would your emissions then be based on those forecasts? So we modeled 10, and I'm going to go through them so you don't have to write them all down at this split second, but we modeled 10 basically target scenarios. So assuming you undertook a number of strategies that will be in the climate action plan, if you achieved these certain outcomes, where would your emissions be through time? So I'll talk about each one of them in a little bit of additional detail. So doubling the EV rate, well, what does that mean? Well, there are EV rate projections about where the market will be in a certain year, okay? And I'll also just go ahead. These slides are going to be shared, and so you're certainly welcome to write notes, but don't feel like you need to jot down every number. So anyways, the EV adoption rate on an annual basis is the percentage of passenger vehicles being purchased as EVs. It's important to realize that that doesn't mean in 2030, for example, that 24% of vehicles on the road will be EVs. They won't. It just means 24% of vehicles being purchased would be EVs. So it will take 12 years on average for that total impact to be felt for each year. What we've done under the target scenario is double that. So basically that means by 2040, all vehicles effectively being purchased are EVs. Doesn't mean in 2040 they all are EVs. Quadrupling bus ridership. So Salem has a fairly low, what we call a mode split. So that's means of getting around other than driving alone. So most people drive to get places, both to work and for enjoyment and whatever other purposes. And that's pretty typical of a city like Salem. That's relatively low density in the grand scheme of things. That's relatively low population. And in your case, that have a lot of people that are commuting from out of town in for work. So under the RTSP plan, you have a projected 1% mode split in 2017 and a 1% in 2043 for bus ridership. So what we're suggesting here is to bump that 1% up to a 4%, okay? This is diving into two together. So this is talking about your inbound, outbound VMT as well as your internal VMT. And we put some boundaries on reducing both of those and at different levels. So to put that in context, what that means is for the external VMT, that would be shifting from 4,200 miles per capita that are occurring inside of Salem. So once you leave Salem, that trip does not count towards this number anymore. So that's why the number is relatively small. Shifting that from 4,200 to 2,500 miles per capita. And that's per capita, not per driver. So per driver, these numbers would actually be a little higher. And reducing internal VMT by 10%. So shifting from 2,800 down to 2,500. If you combine both of those, you end up with approximately a 30% reduction in per capita VMT occurring inside of Salem by 2050, which puts you ahead of that 20 to 25% target. And then I mentioned we talked about the natural gas in a little bit. So what we modeled was decoupling natural gas emissions from growth and reducing the carbon intensity of that fuel. So specifically what we mean by that is shifting to that 85-15 natural gas hydrogen split that Connor was talking about earlier. It's talking about not adding additional growth in activity, so usage data past 2025. Obviously, you could switch that number, but that's what we modeled. And so essentially what that means is no net increase in usage. There's a couple different ways you could think about that, but that's what we modeled. And then we modeled the full impact of a 47% efficiency improvement on the forecast. And then these, I thought these were several together, thought maybe needed less description, so I threw them all up here together. So what we're talking about with an average building efficiency is essentially largely code improvements that would give you a boost of the average building in Salem using 5% less energy by 2025 and 10% less by 2035. Again, you can always shift these dates. It's just that this is specifically what we modeled. Maximizing on-site renewables. So you can think about this as trying to essentially install enough solar to offset 90% of new energy use that will occur as the city continues to grow. Adopting a fossil fuel-free public fleet. So replacing city and eventually bus vehicles with effectively EV vehicles. minimizing emissions from waste, so shifting from Covanta to the landfill, and maximizing your carbon sequestration, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. But this is essentially instead of trying to reduce your emissions, this is trying to maximize your ability to capture emissions. And the ways currently the way you're doing that and measuring is through maintaining your tree canopy. But there are other ways you can do it as well. And so we listed 2 more sort of natural, so to speak, activities that could be undertaken to help capture more carbon. Okay, so as a reminder of kind of where we started, this was the pessimistic baseline forecast. So under this scenario, your emissions increase into the future. What impact would those 10 source reductions have, or 10 projections have on this? So that black line at the top is where you were going under the forecast. The white space is the impact of those 10 scenario reductions. And then in color is your remaining emissions. You'll notice down here on the bottom, below the 0, there's kind of this brown, lovely brown shade, which is your carbon sequestration. So that's what you're capturing. If you had the same quantity above and below the y-axis, then you would be at net 0, even if you were still emitting carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalents. So you have a net 0 goal, so you have the ability to sequester carbon as a viable tool. So under this scenario, clearly you do not achieve your 2035 or your 2050 goals, okay? So like under the worst case scenario, if you undertook these 10, achieved these 10 targets, you wouldn't be where you need to go. Let's talk a little bit more about what's in here, and then we'll shift through the rest of them. What you'll see here is essentially transportation is a big player in what's occurred. We basically went from transportation increasing through time to essentially stabilizing around your current level for emissions. You'll see that electricity, which is the dark pink or dark salmon and the dark blue, those emissions shrink through time, but they remain. And it's important to remember this assumes that, again, this assumes that that PG&E doesn't achieve their 2040 net 0 goal. So when we get into those other forecasts with these actions, you'll see that those electricity emissions disappear. You'll see that natural gas emissions remain, although they essentially are largest now and shrink through time. And then you'll see at the top here in yellow and that little sliver in gray, your wastewater and waste emissions. So if we thought about how we impacted that, well, we did it in 10 ways, and we got those 10 ways led to an 8% reduction from 2016 levels by 2035 and a 10% reduction by 2050 from 2016. So their overall impact is bigger than that, but that's where you're measuring from. So given that, where are most of your emissions being saved? Well, green is transportation, blue is building. You can see that gray piece up top is your waste. So most of your emissions are being reduced by transportation. And I want to pause to say that I broke each one of these 10 out. And so that's why there's different shades of green, different shades of blue. I think it's really critically important to realize that these 10 reduction target scenario reductions, they're not independent of each other, right? So for example, if you failed to double the Eevee rate, then other transportation related scenarios would be more important, like quadrupling the bus ridership, because as EVs take away emissions from transportation, then the other transportation strategies become less impactful. So they all play off each other. So it's quite fair to say that doubling the Eevee rate, which is that dark green on the bottom, is impactful. But if you took that away, the other transportation related scenarios would be more impactful than they are in this setup. So they are interdependent on one another. And you can use the relative size of these to say how important they are. But I wouldn't think of them as being independent from one another. Okay, so that's the pessimistic. So that's, again, our worst case world that we've created. Here's your mid-range. So again, what you see here is the white space between the black line and the color is the emissions you've reduced with those 10 10 scenarios. You fail to achieve the 2035 goal in this context, and clearly you're still above where you want to be in 2050 as well. So overall, you have a 44% reduction by 2035 and a 60% reduction by 2050. So good numbers, just again, not where you want to go, right? What you'll notice here is because as these worlds that we create, these forecasts become better, your overall impact is going to be smaller, because if everyone's buying EVs, for example, the impact you will have on EVs will be smaller. Or if everyone is, so your ability to contribute is super important, but also a small piece of what's occurring that's outside of Salem's control. So what you see here is a closer to even split between transportation and building emissions savings. Most of your emissions saved are coming from natural gas. And we'll move into the optimistic forecast with your 10. So what you see here is you actually achieve your 2035 goal. You're basically right on it. So this assumes, again, you achieve all 10 of these actions. And this is our best case world, although, as I mentioned, I think that it's not the best case world. It's just the best one that we modeled. So here you achieve your 2035. You do fall short of that 2050. And you'll see that because so many of your transportation emissions have effectively been saved by things that are occurring at state and federal and individual levels, your ability to impact that becomes smaller. So the transportation emissions are saved, are pretty small. Natural gas is a good piece of the pie, and then you'll see that gray up top being the waste. So you end up with a 50% reduction by 2035, which is spot on your target, and a 66% reduction by 2050, which is obviously not where you want to be. So I'm going to just talk about what's left, because I think that's some important context setting. So what is left? Well, I'm going to work from the top down. There's a very thin slice of gray that, depending on your screen resolution, and if you're watching this on a phone, you very well may not see. So that little gray piece is your waste. And we essentially modeled we did model that individuals continue to dispose of the same quantity of waste per person as they do today. We've shifted where that goes. So instead of Covanta, we have that going to the landfill, which reduces your per waste emissions, but you are adding more people, and we're assuming they're disposing at the same rate, and therefore you still have waste emissions. So this doesn't factor in ideas like the circular economy, for example. We do have an impact of composting occurring here, but overall, we foresee it quite likely that there's going to be waste emissions in 2050. The next big piece of the pie here is in yellow, and that's your wastewater emissions. Now, we know things are going on in regards to across both the country and the state, and as we zoom into you, that wastewater emissions are a valuable source of methane that can be used either by organizations like Northwest Natural or by electricity providers. And so it's quite possible that that will drive all the way down, or would either drive significantly down or all the way down to zero. But that's just not something that we specifically modeled. And so it's important to note that regardless of whether it's used or not, wastewater emissions are going to occur. It's a natural outcome of biology and being a human being. And you're already doing a lot in terms of your wastewater emissions to minimize them. So kind of the worst case scenario, which at a city level isn't realistic, would be if everybody were on septic. And that's clearly not where you are. You manage your wastewater emissions. You have a high quality wastewater treatment plant. You'll see that most of the blue and pink left in 2050 is natural gas. It's worth noting there's some very small slivers of emissions left from Salem Electric being modeled here, but they're so small that unless you have a screen like mine, you might not actually see the dark blue and dark pink. So I do want to briefly talk on the natural gas here, and I'm not the Northwest Natural expert, nor am I the natural gas expert. So it's worth noting that if in 2050 Northwest Natural is has achieved their goals and is using 100% renewable natural gas that they're pulling from the sources that Connor has talked about, that at a state level, your emissions are actually going down because they're using, to Connor's point, they're using methane and essentially converting it into carbon dioxide. So when you zoom out to the state level, that activity has a state benefit that would reduce your state inventory emissions. When we zoom into Salem, the picture is less clear because Salem, at least my understanding, and Connor's welcome to correct me, Salem itself is not going to produce enough natural gas to offset Salem. It's going to require other places in the state, and those places are outside of your inventory, and so they're not being counted. So this is kind of the artifact of inventory versus what's good at a societal level. And at least today, our understanding of ICLEI's guidance on renewable natural gas is to include the emissions. And so we can't include the sinks because they're occurring outside of city limits, but we're still including the emissions. That may very well change in terms of the guidance, or at least our interpretation of the guidance before 2050, but today that's how we read it. And so we still have those chunks left in. We also didn't think that it was realistic to model any scenario in which Salem turned off natural gas, so to speak. That's really beyond what we see any city in the world doing at this point. At the very, setting a target where you would actually turn off new permits, so to speak, is already really like broaching the very far end of what any city's even talking about doing. So we saw that as already pretty darn out there. And so to turn off that infrastructure, we just don't believe that's possible. And that would have massive implications for the electricity grid, which would then require a separate series of modeling, because we can't just turn that off and assume it's picked up by electricity. That simply wouldn't occur without some significant changes. So the last piece here is transportation, which is, I think, really the most interesting piece because it's the most diverse in terms of what's left. So what is left in transportation? Well, 3/4 of it, so to speak, is heavy trucking. So you have some passenger cars and light trucks, et cetera, that are essentially, I hope at this point in 2050, really old internal combustion engine cars that you've got driving around the road for whatever reason. So they just haven't aged out of the fleet yet. And it hasn't been long enough, even under our 100% purchasing by 2040 of EVs, to essentially eradicate all internal combustion cars. In purple at the very top are your emissions from flights. So we assumed really no change there, and they stay a small piece of the pie. But heavy trucking is a challenging one. When we thought about what impact Salem has on heavy trucking and the ability to change that, the answer is probably pretty darn minimal. Goods and services need to flow into Salem, and the primary way that occurs today is through heavy trucking. So there are these certain pieces that are certainly possible that those will be, as I mentioned earlier, will disappear via certain technological improvements that we didn't model, but our models show that there's still a significant amount of heavy trucking emissions occurring. So that's what's left, okay? And so let's talk about Salem's goal in some context here. So the target scenarios that we showed you on top of those forecasts project anywhere between a 10 and 66% reduction from 2016 to 2050 in greenhouse gas emissions, depending on which set of forecasting assumptions you like the best. Under that optimistic scenario, so kind of the best world we showed, there are certain emissions that, so to speak, are kind of baked in, that are possible to get rid of they're possible to get rid of, but maybe infeasible to get rid of today, or that have a net benefit at a state level, but still negatively impact you at a local level. And so it becomes really challenging. Basically, when we get out to 2050 under that optimistic scenario, we've pretty much reduced all of the emissions that we can reduce. And the things that are left require things that we just didn't make assumptions around. And then last, it's important to note that you have a really ambitious goal, which is fantastic, but you have a really ambitious goal. And the Paris Agreement essentially assumes that the United States needs to reduce about 80% of emissions by 2050. It's not apples to apples, but you're at 100%. And that puts you as a leader And it means that that's going to be a very challenging goal to achieve. So I think the obvious question is, if I don't answer, it's probably going to be the first thing I get asked, which is how do we get to net zero given what I just showed you? And I think there's a couple things worth noting. One is that there are technological solutions that can't necessarily be quantified and will likely be important by 2050. So there's no magic, deus ex machina coming down, or however you pronounce that in Latin, coming down the road that's just going to solve all our problems. But there are things that will help your emissions that we just can't model yet. So I mentioned EVs as an example. If we'd done this 30 years ago, we wouldn't have assumed EVs as a tool that we'd use to reduce emissions. Likewise, we already know that there are certain technologies, for example, we can already pull carbon dioxide out of the air. That's not the problem. The problem is making that economically feasible and expanding it at a rate that makes it a useful tool, right? So there are certain, it's also worth noting that there are certain actions today that we noted a couple of them that just aren't really feasible politically or technologically. And they're infeasible today. That doesn't mean by 2030 or 2040 that they won't be. So there may be things that we don't necessarily recommend moving forward on now. A good example of this that we talked about early on was, well, could Salem implement some sort of congestion pricing with vehicles? Well, the reality is no city in the United States does that today. So the likelihood that Salem could be the first to adopt it ahead of places like New York City seems relatively unlikely. That doesn't mean by 2030, 2050, you aren't doing things like that. Last, I do want to note that one thing we didn't model, and there's good reason not to, are offsets. So if you're not familiar with offsets, the simplest version is, and it's overly simplified, is basically if I emit a certain amount of carbon dioxide, I can buy a certain number of trees to absorb that carbon dioxide, and that will lead to net zero. There are lots of caveats to that, lots of assumptions I didn't cover, but that is one possible tool in your toolbox that we're not talking about. Couple thoughts on that very briefly are you have to buy them every year if you want to use them, and they're generally they're not inexpensive. And so if you thought about your emissions in 2016 at 1.5 million metric tons at kind of market price, and it varies dramatically by what your program you're doing, a good low price would be around $6 per metric ton. 6 times 1.5 million every single year is a really expensive program to undertake. But you do have carbon sequestration as one of your possible tools, and you are doing things like planting trees today that have an impact there. So some kind of, I think, big key takeaways, although you might have some other ones, are transportation emissions. They're the biggest piece of your pie, and they're the most challenging. There's so many different sources they come from. You don't have several big utilities that control the carbon intensity of your vehicles. What's controlling that today is state and federal laws and a lot of individual choice. And so you are stuck with a challenge, which is more than 50% of your emissions come from transportation, and getting rid of those emissions entirely today is not yet feasible. It may be by 2050, but it isn't today. I think it's also really critical to note that your gas and electricity utility goals are the gas and electricity utility goals set by Northwest Natural, Salem Electric, PG&E. They're absolutely critical for Salem to achieve a 2035 or a 2050 goal. So they are the most essential partners when it comes to reducing your building emissions, and they are going to play a hugely critical role. And so having that relationship between the city and these utilities is absolutely critical, because they are big players in terms of what their goals are for their impact on your goals. One big takeaway I have is that Salem has a pathway to a 50% reduction by 2035 that's currently achievable with all the assumptions and all the tools we have in hand today. So certainly, I think from an optimistic standpoint, there's a pathway, and that's, well, 14 years now down the road, and that's achievable. There is a way to get there. What's more challenging is your 100% reduction goal by 2050. And that's going to depend on a lot of factors, including things like technology and behavioral changes to eliminate fossil fuel usage that today don't seem fully feasible, but may be more feasible in the years to come. So a couple next steps just to put them on your radar. We've got a feedback survey on climate action plan strategies coming down the pipeline. I can let Kim speak more on that if any questions come up about that. And then the next task force workshop is April 7th. So, and then I'll just leave up here for a second, and then I'll take my slides down for the discussion. But you're always welcome to email me. That's for questions or any other commentary. I know after the last workshop, quite a number of folks did. And so really appreciated a lot of the feedback we got as well as the questions. I think that there's a big group, a big brain trust here. And so having all of you to contribute and pull from, that's the whole purpose of this group. And so I would strongly recommend contacting me if you have questions or comments.
All right, thank you so much, Brian. And I do want to apologize, Brian, I don't know if you noticed, but we had accidentally put Pacific Gas and Electric instead of Portland Gas and Electric. So our apologies, just a typo. We do know which one is which. I'm going to start off.
I apologize for that. It's usually good to name the utility provider correctly. So sorry about that, folks.
I'm going to start off with a question that Alan just dropped in the chat because I thought this was a good one. And then if you have questions, please raise your hand. But Brian, he asked if the 10 reduction improvement, the 10 target scenarios that you modeled, are they the ones that yielded the biggest changes in overall GHG emissions over each forecast?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about the route in which we got to those. Essentially, what we wanted to do was we started out with the question of where are your emissions coming from? And so hopefully you know the answer to that now. And then we asked, given that, where are areas in which we can reduce those emissions? So transportation, for example, well, you have a couple options. You can reduce your VMT, you can reduce your emissions released per mile, and you can shift those miles into other modes that are less carbon intensive. So there's kind of, at a high scale anyways, three ways you can move your transportation emissions. So we went through that exercise to try to pull out what were meaningful. And then in discussions with folks at the city, a couple other folks, ICLEI, we tried to identify at a high level, where are the places we could reduce them, have the greatest impact, and also spread them out so that, for example, we could target areas like waste. And so it's not necessarily the 10 that would give you the biggest, and certainly could also shift. As you noticed, we set a number on those, right? So like doubling the Eevee rate would certainly not be as impactful as quadrupling the Eevee rate. The question is, where was a realistic bound to set? So we put up some recommendations, and with those same folks, we asked them questions about, okay, hey, if we shift, like, where do you think we could get to from a mode split on bus ridership if money wasn't a significant issue? Like if you could expand more bus routes, et cetera. And so that's where we tried to set them within a realistic bound of relatively difficult to achieve, but also achievable. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thanks, Brian.
I see somebody wants to see that slide again, so I'll pop that up at least briefly here. And then I can take more questions as well. And I apologize if Kim, if you want to call on people with hands raised, that's helpful when I have the screen share up.
Okay, sure, no problem. John, you had your hand up.
No. Yeah, Brian, thanks. Question, you have a fairly significant reduction in VMT per capita, and I think it was about 40%. And then you had a quadrupling of bus rides. Are you incorporating other measures to get that VMT per capita reduction, or is that all from the increase from 1% to 4% in bus ridership?
Yeah, so no, it's not. So the way we're thinking about this, it's a chicken and the egg question. It's, do you want to model like an individual strategy, for example, which might be like a $500 rebate program or something, or free transit passes, or whatever you want to have your individual strategy be, or do you want to model an outcome? So we decided to model the outcomes, and each one of those is going to be made up of a composite of strategies. So your climate action plan is going to have, and I'm sure I've got the number wrong, but well over 100 strategies, right? I mean, it's significantly more than that. And those strategies, a subset of each of those are going to be impactful for reducing or for reaching each one of these targets. So we would see, like, to reduce the external VMT, for example, that would be things like implementing a trip reduction ordinance, installing meters downtown, and having a supply demand model for how you price those meters, et cetera. So each one of those would be a strategy that would, in composite, help you reach that target. And then there are also going to be things that are happening, which we don't account for, but happening at levels outside of your bounds, market impacts, state and federal decisions, et cetera.
Kaylee, you have your hand up.
Yeah, hi. So my question is, if we are focused solely on greenhouse gas emissions, how are we ensuring that the actions that we're planning to take are not having unintended environmental consequences? It kind of came up, I come from the water quality background, and just as you had kind of casually mentioned, in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from wastewater, everyone would be on septic. And from a water quality perspective, like, we're still kind of reeling from a lot of septic issues. So how would we balance kind of that conversation when we solely talk about greenhouse gases?
Yeah, so sorry, I actually said the opposite, or at least I intended to say the opposite. So if I misspoke, I apologize. I said the worst thing you could do is have everybody on septic from a GHG standpoint.
Gotcha.
So my talk specifically is about, that we just covered, is obviously about GHG reductions, but the climate action plan as a whole is not. And so it's much more comprehensive, as people in the group are aware, a much more comprehensive plan than just reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. Likewise, the strategies that you're going to undertake in your climate action plan are not all targeted towards greenhouse gas reduction. I'd be interested when we're wrapping this up to see what percentage are. And many of those strategies that you would undertake, they're not necessarily, even if they do have an impact, that's not their only impact. So the climate action plan is intended to be much broader than that. It's just that this specific focus today is on GHG emissions. So I think, and I'll look to Kim and some of the other folks that are more in the weeds on the rest of the climate action plan than I am, things like water, food, sustainability, those sorts of areas are covered as well.
Yes, and just to say, Kaylee, we want to make sure that every strategy that's included in the plan has holistic benefits. So we would never include something that reduced GHG but had negative impacts somewhere else. So we try to look at co-benefits. Janet, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was wondering, what are the strategies that would give us the biggest reduction on greenhouse gases that you deemed, kind of not politically feasible, not worth modeling? I'm curious about that. And I'm also wondering, we've talked a lot about equity. When does equity come into our modeling discussion?
Yeah, so it's important that to your first question in regards to what we deemed not feasible. So that didn't actually impact the scenarios that we modeled. That would just impact our recommendations for which strategies you would undertake to achieve those outcomes. So again, the chicken and the egg, the strategies are the eggs, and what we showed today is the chicken. We might pick a couple eggs out and say, we don't think today in 2021 you ought to do these first. So I can't think of a full comprehensive list, but for example, one of your scenarios we modeled was reducing internal VMT by 10%. Well, you could certainly get there as one possible strategy being congestion pricing. But in 2021, is it likely that Salem is going to undertake congestion pricing? Probably not, just given where the world and particularly the United States is. So could you undertake that strategy at some point to help you get to that target? Absolutely. It's just when we would put together a list of strategies, that wouldn't be one we would gung ho, you should definitely do this in 2021 because we just
I
don't
meant
think.
examples that you hadn't already mentioned.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, like
These are
one
the ones that
example.
look to the back of
could
my
be-
head.
One example could be taxing all internal combustion engine vehicles. That would have probably a big impact on GHG, but it's probably not a realistic idea.
Yes, thank you, Kim.
And likewise, you know, you could simply shut off all natural gas tomorrow. So that means that everyone in an existing home that has natural gas, you know, would have to take it out. That would have a big impact, but that's not really realistic.
Right, and actually both those examples are really good ones that have some significant social justice component issues as well, because those would more
I feel like you're
negatively impact people.
overcorrecting. I feel like you're overcorrecting and suggesting things that no one in existence is suggesting, right? So I'm just curious about that, you know, like progressive cutting edge that you're dismissing. I'm wondering if there are other things happening there that maybe ICLEI is talking about, that people are actually talking about, that you have not modeled.
I don't think we are dismissing anything. We have some.
I don't think we are either.
Strategies.
I think that most of what we've excluded, like the reason you think these examples are extreme that I'm giving you is because those are the things we excluded. I can't think of one that we were like really on the edge of like, Salem could probably do this, but we're going to exclude it. If it's on the edge or even a little bit past the edge, I think that would be on our list. But certainly, you know, then one of the next
Aren't there 40
is that
cities?
strategy list, Janet, and that would be a really good opportunity for you to see all the specifics. And then I haven't seen the exact survey that will be going out, but I'm sure there's an opportunity to comment on it. And if there isn't, obviously you can email us, but there'd be a opportunity to comment on where you see things that we should have included. So.
I just wanted to point out that there are 40 cities in California that have stopped natural gas from going into new buildings.
Right, and that was on our list. We talked about that during the presentation as that's in the decouple natural gas emissions from growth, reduce carbon intensity. Well, one of the three things we listed, which I can go to that slide, is right here. No additional growth in new activity. So that is effectively, essentially not permitting new natural gas would be one of the ways you could achieve that. So that we do have that included, and that is, I would argue, very cutting edge.
And how do we fit an equity discussion into your modeling? Like when do we talk about equity in relation to the modeling?
Yep. So that's, again, more strategy focused than outcome focused, which is what we're talking about right here. But there are opportunities to do that both as individuals when that survey comes out, but also I believe a lot of that discussion is through Ecotone's work when they're talking about the cost and benefit and who those costs and the benefits accrue to.
Yeah, I can say another word about that too. And just to kind of elucidate what Brian mentioned, what we have is a big comprehensive strategy list that we've been working on over the last several weeks, and it incorporates all the ideas that you all have contributed, as well as all the ideas that the public contributed over it was about a month-long period where we had a tool available on the website, and we received tons of ideas there. And so we have created a fairly comprehensive list of recommended strategies, and we're going to be turning that into a survey. And next week, you're going to get a link to this survey, and we're going to be asking for your reactions to each of the ideas. Kind of like a green light, yellow light, red light. You know, is this look good to you? Do you have concerns? Or, you know, stop the presses, this won't work. So we want to get your opinions on all of those. And Janet, many of those strategies also already incorporate equity issues, because that's really important to us all the way through this plan. It's already come up repeatedly in the ideas that you all have contributed so far. And then finally, what we're going to do in the last hour of this meeting is Kate is going to lead us in a whole discussion about how equity issues should figure into the plan. So we're just about to discuss it more. Okay, I want to read a couple questions in the chat. This one came from Mike Jaffe. He said, this has to do with methane and wastewater treatment plants. He says, for communities like Eureka, California, or Forest Grove, Oregon, that include natural systems for wastewater processing, do they have significantly lower methane emissions than communities like Salem that rely on water treatment plants? Brian, do you know the answer to that one?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm reading the question. I just scrolled up to it.
I think it's Forest Grove, but it might be the next community over.
Well, I can speak to that only at a very high and relatively uninformed level, because I'm not familiar with Eureka or Forest Grove's particular waste. I saw somebody laugh, so that's good. I'm not aware of their particular wastewater treatment methods. The way in which you treat wastewater has a significant impact on the emissions. And there is a lovely chapter in ICLEI's US Community Protocol that is way too heavily deep in all of these details. And so if I was more familiar with their process, I'd probably be able to answer that. But it is just to say that the way in which you treat the same quantity of wastewater has very different impacts on the amount of emissions released. So based on what I'm reading, it's quite likely that they would have lower emissions, but I can't answer that without knowing a lot more about the steps for their process.
It's more of looking at qualitatively, if you have those natural systems, do they cut it back by 10% or 50% or 80%? Just to get an idea if that's a strategy the city should look into if they haven't looked into it in the past.
Well, the biggest impact you can have is ensuring that your wastewater emissions, so the biggest wastewater emissions impact you can have is ensuring that it's processed aerobically, so that you release significantly less methane, or if you do it anaerobically to capture that methane, and then, for example, use it through activities such as natural gas.
Yeah.
Mike, did you have any other questions?
Well, I'd just like to see like a range. Like maybe there are places that have the cutting edge technology and have reduced their greenhouse gases from their wastewater treatment plant by 90%. And then there might be other ones that are doing it by 50%, 60%. I'd just like to get a range to see what Salem may want to invest
Yeah, I'm not able to give you that range today. I'm certainly happy to follow up with you and look at that a little bit more. I think very generally, again, not answering your question, is that the way in which Salem is processing its wastewater is it's a high quality processing. So it's the opportunity to reduce the emissions from your wastewater via improving the process is probably relatively limited. So I wouldn't put it at like a 80% reduction. You might, and this is just me making up a number, might be able to do like a 10% reduction or a 20% reduction. So it's going to be on the lower end because you already do a lot there.
Okay, one more question going back in the chat. Tom Anderson asked about Covanta, and I know there have been some questions about that, Brian. I think he's asking what was the percentage of emissions in total that come from Covanta, and how does this affect the overall scenario?
Yeah, your waste emissions as a whole are 1% of your inventory, and Covanta is the majority of that. So 1% basically. So in today, like if you were to shut off the Covanta plant or your portion of your waste going to the Covanta plant, it's a relatively small piece of the pie. It becomes bigger as you go further out because your emissions are shrinking, but it's relatively small. And that was the balance to, I think, the first question that we got asked from Alan, maybe it was Alan, about how we balanced these different, like which of these target scenarios to model. And so this was a balance between trying to figure out biggest bang for your buck, so to speak, at this very high level, but also making sure to get a wide range in there. And so that's in particular why waste and carbon sequestration were included, even though their relative impact today is relatively small. It just broadens the scope of strategies you're able to take to reduce your GHG emissions. And obviously there are lots of other Covanta benefits to not sending your waste there.
Kim and Brian, if I could just add on that,
Sure.
The other half of that is it's an equity issue, because most of the material, even if it's only 1%, most of the material that is spewed out of there is going to the, relatively speaking, lower income and more areas of color in Salem, that's North Salem, than going to the South Hills or Fairmont Hill or any other place where it's a higher income sort of place. So to me, even though it's 1%, we could just say, oh, it's only 1%, but we also have to say maybe 80% of that 1% is affecting people on the lower equity scale. So that's, to me, is the balance we have to consider in the future. Is it worth it on an equity scale to do something about Covanta, even only on a total scale, Covanta is only 1%.
Absolutely. And that's part of that thinking is part of the reason we included it as one of these 10.
Good. Kim, may I make one other comment?
Sure.
Okay, I want to make sure everybody else has had a chance to talk about this. First of all, I'm the chair of the finance committee of the city council, and we've been talking about chicken egg. I think it's carrot stick. And one of the things I want to push forward is a gas tax increase, which it's also a fundraiser, but it can only be used for transportation type issues, such, I believe, as sidewalks and other issues that we have. But it also, it could be a downward force on gas use and VMTs.
Yep. So that would absolutely impact both of those VMT targets. Sorry, Kim, I know we're going over. One last thing that I want to mention that I forgot to mention when we were talking about natural gas. In particular, we had the no new growth target past 2025. What I want to make sure people understand is that what that doesn't include is, or doesn't preclude maybe, is Northwest Natural undertaking other activities like expanding, for example, a dedicated hydrogen line to large commercial users, things like that. So we are trying to balance the challenge of emissions, but also the and this is coming from outside and not knowing their business model, ensuring that there's a viable system in place to continue. So no new growth in natural gas, but that doesn't mean no new growth in non-emitting sources like hydrogen.
Okay, we actually have a few more minutes. We're going to break at 10:55. I wanted to turn to one more question in the chat, and then we can go back to live questions. But Michael Kuehler, forgive me if I mispronounced your name, he had this great question in the chat. Regardless of technology advancement and local behavior change over the next 30 years, transportation includes taking into account commuters and freeway or through traffic within the city boundaries. And it seems like zero emissions wouldn't be possible because of this. So then is the idea that carbon capture technologies can be used to offset those through fare transportation emissions?
Oh, that's a big question to unpack. Okay, a couple things. One, transportation emissions. We had good discussion last time. I'm apologizing. I can't remember who followed up with us outside of that to ask some more really good questions. Transportation emissions that we're showing, I misspoke last time. They do not include I-5 traffic that's just passing through. So what we're talking about right now is only trips that occur either entirely within the bounds of Salem or start or stop inside of Salem. So that, I think it takes care of part of the first concern. But I think you're also right that because you can sort of feasibly, your ability to limit somebody coming in with an internal combustion engine from somewhere else is pretty limited. And really, it's also pretty limited to within your city limits for residents as well. You have carrots and sticks, but maybe not big enough carrots and sticks to completely get everybody to an EV, right? So yes, you will almost certainly have transportation related emissions in 2050. And then if you still have those, the only way to effectively deal with them is through carbon sequestration of some sort. So that's activities you're undertaking today, like your urban tree canopy, That's activities like composting or managing your public lands for carbon sequestration through soil and other means. And it could potentially be through technologies that haven't been widely implemented yet, but exist, such as capturing it out of the air, using cement that captures carbon dioxide and leads to net negative carbon emissions, et cetera. So yeah, that's why we included that as one of those 10, is I think it will be very difficult to achieve a 2050 100% reduction without sequestering carbon of some sort.
Just a quick follow-up to that then. With the plans that are being created specifically to Salem, and if we're talking specifically about reducing or the outcomes, are we connecting our plan to other localities, state or federal as well, to try and collaborate on those goals? So that way, let's say if commutership into Salem is pretty high, that means that we would need to work with other localities in order to actually drive down that outcome. So is that also being considered within, I guess, planning strategy-wise to drive down that outcome?
There are quite a number of the strategies that discuss relationship building and collaboration at a regional level, and I believe at a state level as well. So I think that the very, very short answer is yes.
We have 2 minutes left. Kaylee.
Yeah, so Tom's discussion, as well as some of Janet's comments, I don't know if maybe this has been provided and I haven't seen it, but is there any mapping that has been done around the impacts, greenhouse gas emissions or other environmental impacts in terms of like an equity lens? So, we could see, a map of Salem that shows along the I-5 corridor or kind of North Salem, like where the impacts are actually hitting harder. So if we're talking about public health impacts, is there anything that we could possibly see so that we could put ourselves in that like equity frame of reference?
Yes, absolutely. The city has been working on some GIS mapping that we're going to have ready to show you pretty soon. And they're just to clarify that the specific like GHG emissions in a map wouldn't be particularly helpful, but what is really helpful is to understand the climate impacts. So where are the overlapping issues where you might have areas of high poverty and urban heat island, for example, or where are the areas where you might have susceptibility to flooding? Where are the areas that are, the transportation routes that might be affected in case of wildfire, et cetera. And so we are looking at that. The city's working on that, and we'll have some nice maps. It'll be like a whole online interactive thing for you to look at pretty soon. Thanks for asking that. Okay, maybe one last question before we break.
I saw somebody clap their hands and then was disappointed we didn't go on break. So
Well, maybe that's a sign. Okay, thank you all for your great questions. As Brian said, we will have his slide deck, the corrected version, available on the website after this meeting. And so you'll be able to go through them again if you'd like to study it. Brian did include, I think there was a question about whether he's going to be including his assumptions. I think he's got all the main assumptions included within the slide deck, but if you have any questions about some of the background data that went into it, feel free to reach out to Brian. So let's take a 15-minute break and reconvene at 10 minutes after 11. Well, I see a lot of people have turned their cameras off, which is fine. If you're back from break, you can go ahead and turn your cameras on and we'll get started in just a moment. Okay, welcome back. Hope everyone had a chance to stretch your legs and do what you need to do. We're going to dive into our last hour of today's workshop. And as you may know, doing this climate action plan using an equity lens is very important to us as at Veritas Group and important to the city of Salem as well. And so we wanted to specifically allocate some time in today's meeting to have a conversation about how equity figures into the creation of the climate action plan. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Kate Hamill.
Thanks, Kim. So like Kim said, this task force as a group has envisioned a process and an outcome for the climate action plan that really centers equity. So we talked about it in the very first workshop. It's come up several times just today. It's clearly important to you all and it's important to us, like Kim said. So as we move forward with the development, refinement, prioritization of strategies, we wanted to have a conversation about kind of how to hold ourselves accountable to that vision. So Kim shared with you in the homework a while back some different resources that outline how social and racial injustice are embedded in climate change issues and how equity has been kind of incorporated into climate action in other places. So I dropped the link to each of those resources that were sort of your readings for homework, if you want to refer to those. But I wanted to start with a little bit of an activity to help kind of get us thinking about that homework and the topic of equity in general with relation to the climate action plan. So let me drop a link to what is called a Jamboard, which is kind of a dumbed down version of Miro, but don't worry, we're not going to be using Miro still. So if all of you want to go to that link that I just dropped that says jamboard.google. So I know it's been a while since we sent out these readings, but I want you to kind of think about what stood out about those readings, the Oakland Equitable Climate Action Plan, the excerpt from the Oregon document, and then the Vancouver Climate Equity Statement. And so if you can't remember what stood out to you about those, you can also think about kind of what you're thinking with regard to equity and the climate action plan, some of the things that you've brought up today, that kind of thing. So when you get into the Jamboard, if you see on the left side, kind of similar to Miro, there's like a sticky note icon. If you click on that, you can type in your thoughts and then add the sticky to the board. Great, looks like someone's already going, so that's awesome. So we're just gonna take kind of a few minutes for you all to add your thoughts to this board. We'll kind of talk about that and we'll dive into a little bit further discussion. And if you're having trouble with the Jamboard, just type your thoughts into the chat here and we'll get that added to the board. So we'll give you a few minutes to kind of refresh your memory, think about kind of what stood out to you and add your thoughts to the board. Any questions? Okay, I'll give you a few minutes. So it looks like you guys have a lot of thoughts, which is awesome. There's some comments on process, kind of how do we promote equity if we don't have those most impacted at the table during the development of the cap. I think that's a really good point. A couple of points from Vancouver, this idea of making sure that the cost burdens fall on folks who can afford it and who are the ones who are contributing the most to climate change. I think that was a really interesting point. Vancouver's equity statement kind of really called that out. Let's see, what else do we have on here? Talking about outcomes. So thinking about how do we prevent strategies from displacing people, resulting in disparities in resource allocation, excuse me, things like that. Let's see, what else do we have on here? Yeah, lots of thoughts with regard to strategy outcomes, which is really important, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit later and then in the next workshop as well. Yeah, someone else called out this idea that Oakland kind of centered equity in each chapter, and that was something that stood out to me as well, is this idea of kind of figuring out how it relates to each different action area and talking about how equity is going to be kind of implemented in each of those areas. Yeah, these are great. Okay, so I just kind of wanted to get us warmed up and thinking about these things, and it's very clear that all of you think about this topic a lot, so we can go ahead and move on. But I thought it would be good to refresh our memories about kind of what the subject is. So we want to talk today about how we see equity being integrated into Salem's climate action plan. And we have some ideas already based on conversations we've had as a group. But we want to kind of draw on your expertise in the Salem community and start from a little bit of a higher level. So identifying some of the key concerns you have around equity, and then eventually kind of dialing in and narrowing down and taking a critical look at how each of the strategies we're putting forward, kind of the co-benefits they might be able to have, any unintended consequences, things like that. And that's, we'll get into that a little bit today, but we'll also have to kind of push that back once you guys have a chance to take a look at those strategies more specifically. So we're going to have a large group discussion, and we're going to use that Zoom raise hand feature again. In the name of full transparency and equity within this process, we know that there are folks on, I was going to say in this room, but I suppose on this call, who have expertise around equity. So we really want to elevate those voices during this conversation, by which I mean we'll be giving certain folks the opportunity to respond and speak first if they so choose. But we'll only call on you if you raise your hand. So we're not going to put anyone on the spot. But this is just a time we kind of want to hear from less dominant voices, if that makes sense. And I wanted to call that out so everyone's kind of aware and is kind of allowing space for that. So any questions before we dive into the first question we have for discussion? Okay. So we're going to start broad. So what are some of the most significant or important equity issues in Salem that you guys have seen? Anyone can raise their hand. Kaylee.
I was just going to ask for clarification. That seems like a really big question for me. Can you, like equity just in terms of like climate action plan, like equity?
So yes, it is a really broad question. And I think we're kind of intending it to be broad so to get a little bit of context, but yeah, maybe a little bit more clarity. I think we're just thinking, because we don't necessarily live in Salem, kind of understanding how what people have seen in the past in terms of equity issues and policies, or just like, so what are some of the key kind of issues that are specific to the Salem community, to kind of get that background. Does that, I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be related to climate action, although most equity issues are wrapped up in climate action. Does that give you any clarity?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. So with that being said, you know, we've seen in the survey that one of the issues that comes up over and over and over is affordable housing. So we've noted kind of that as one significant piece to keep in mind as we move forward. So just throw out there, what are some equity issues that Salem has seen? Yes, Dylan.
I would say investment in the eastern part, especially like the Lancaster, thinking about tree canopy cover is lower there. There's a lot of paved areas. I think that's where we also have lower, thinking about just where our racial equity is, that's an area where I think we could invest more and try and connect that to the downtown corridor, especially thinking about access points there. So I would say as we think about that area as kind of wrapping up everything you were just saying, trying to make sure we highlight that and focus it.
Perfect, thank you. Leslie?
Well, I thought that your suggestions next to your first number one were right on for seniors. You said affordable housing, 80% of seniors want to stay in their own housing, access to healthy food, representation in the decision-making, access to reliable transportation. Those four were the top when we were looking at age-friendly communities when we did our plan in Salem a few years ago. So I don't think you can pick just one. You can't say, well, what's the most important? Those are huge for seniors. So they're all important.
Definitely. Thanks, Leslie. So Leslie just kind of reiterated some that I had brought up in a previous conversation. Affordable housing, access to healthy food, just to reiterate what she said, representation and decision-making, and access to reliable transportation. And these were some that came up in the other examples as well. Those are probably some really common ones. Janet, yes.
Alex with Luce, who's not here today, I think, did a survey around East Salem, Northeast Salem, and asked people, like, what do they need? So I think getting that information would be ideal. He did mention to me a few of the main takeaways, which, you know, the first was kind of affordable housing, and also, you know, kind of avoiding displacement and kind of avoiding gentrification. You know, the importance of transportation, also the importance of, you know, kind of thinking about the order in which things are done. So maybe you want to like complete the sidewalks before you try to create like a bike lane or something like that. Also kind of educational opportunities and linguistic inclusion in what the city is doing. And as Leslie said, you know, that, you know, kind of continued participation. So this isn't the only time that the community is involved in these you know, kind of the strategies going forward. There were also on healthy food and like health access, like HIV testing and things like that.
Thanks, Janet. Yeah, I'm bummed Alex isn't here. I was hoping to hear from him as well, but I really appreciate you sharing about that survey. That's awesome. I'll make sure to connect with him on that. I'm looking to see if anyone else has their hand raised. So any other issues that we need to kind of bring to the focus as we move forward in talking about equity within the Salem community that you guys want to highlight? Kaylee.
Michael actually had his hand up before me.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see that. Michael.
I was just going to mention that with the county, I know it's greater than just Salem, but a community health improvement plan or a assessment, I should say, was conducted with over 100 partners in the area. And the things that were highlighted specifically for health, but kind of relate obviously to equity as well, as mental health supports, substance use, and housing were specifically targeted transportation was also high up on the list as well. So.
Thanks, Michael. Casey, did you want to go next?
You can let Ian had his or Kaylee, either one.
Okay, Kaylee.
Thanks. I just wanted to kind of make a note that I guess personally, like as a white female, I don't know that I am like the best person to address issues of equity. And, you know, I would hope to be able to ask that question to more of the experts or the people that experiencing the inequity, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Like I have been hearing in our community that seem to really kind of bubble to the surface right now are a lot of with issues around our unsheltered neighbors, just the rise in individuals who are becoming unsheltered,
Mm-hmm.
access to services, and kind of the inequity as it relates to COVID. So how COVID has really kind of, I guess, highlighted some of the inequity, caused it to be much more severe for certain members of, and then racial inequity. Salem isn't a very like racially diverse necessarily. It's not one of the most racially diverse, but there are a number of instances that have arisen around just racial inequity that I think are really important to our community safety and community just well-being.
Thanks, Kaylee. Ian?
Thanks. Yeah, I think that the city has at times, and perhaps even now, privileges automobiles over people to a pretty large extent. The Salem Reporter, one of our local news agencies, recently highlighted Northeast Salem as one of those areas where there's been significant disrepair of the sidewalk infrastructure. And as has been talked about here before, there's significant areas of the region that do not have adequate sidewalk. I know the Council of Governments has done really good work of cataloging where those gaps are. But I think some of that, of course, is funding, how much funding we're spending to fill those gaps, but also what we're subsidizing. And we subsidize automobiles quite a bit, both in the built environment with actual parking structures, but also with parking minimums, where we're asking everyone else to subsidize the cost of somebody's individual car. And I think that's a big piece of transportation equity.
Definitely. Thanks, Ian. Casey?
Okay. Thanks. I wanted to go after Ian because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to say the same thing he was, because mine was transportation related, and I felt like it might be. One of the things that I see is that it's related to the transit, public transit and buses in particular, and that is that our bus fares make up about 8 to 9% of the revenue of the total pie that the Salem the transit chariots has. Of that, it is disproportionately reduced fare people that are paying those 8 to 9%. So for me, when I look at, well, that's such a small piece of what we're actually using to fund our transit, which needs to be a big component of how we hit our goals in the future. And we're placing that small piece of the burden disproportionately on people that can't necessarily afford it as well as I could if I, if you were to say, hey, Casey, we're going to tax you $2 a month. This is hypothetically. And, passenger service will be free, fareless rather, with a $2 tax on people like me. And I'd be like, yeah, okay, I can afford that, no problem. But so there's kind of an inequity in the people that are relying on this aren't the ones that can't necessarily afford to rely on it. And then at the same time, one of the things that I've seen in my work in mental health, I work for the Secretary of State here in Oregon, and there's a cycle of social determinants, and we talked about it a little bit. And it's that due to lack of prioritization, things like folks with substance abuse or low education, low income, gender identification, mental health issues, literacy, and so on and so forth, disproportionately have worse outcomes, and then consequences that put them back into positions to kind of repeat that cycle. and we don't emphasize breaking that cycle enough by putting resources where we need to.
Great points. Thanks, Casey. So I want to kind of move into a more specific question, and bear with me. Sorry for being so broad at the beginning, but thinking about the climate vulnerabilities that we've discussed in previous workshops, how do you see your organization, your community, or other communities that you know about in Salem being affected by climate change, and what concerns you the most? So what are your greatest concerns around climate impacts? Leslie.
I feel like the Lorax, I speak for the trees. I'm speaking for seniors now, and I wrote in my my note that the senior umbrella, encompasses the whole area, racial, low income. So, it's the big one, but mobility, isolation during during COVID, during any kind of natural disaster. Not that COVID was brought on by climate change, but maybe it was. No, just kidding. Mobility, isolation, equity for seniors. Climate vulnerabilities for seniors include, the wildfire smoke, the heat, the extreme heat, the cold during the electricity pause that we had. And for some seniors just living outside of the Salem area, lack of water, and that isolation and that lack of mobility needs to be addressed. Those are all products of the climate change. Flooding is, we haven't had that for a bit, but isolation and, people not knowing that there's a senior in that house. So what can we do to increase the visibility of and address the equity issue of the senior population?
Thanks, Leslie. Others want to share the climate vulnerabilities that they're most concerned about? Janet?
I know that heat waves actually kill more people than all other natural disasters combined, and we don't generally take them very seriously. So I think that, that we're still, builders are still building in floodplains in Salem and selling those houses. So I think that's a problem. I think more hot days and heat waves is a problem. I think, smoke from wildfires is a significant problem. And I really liked the idea in the Oakland Equitable Climate Action Plan where they talked about resiliency hubs or resilient hubs. And so I think you could have like a community center in East Salem that is also a cooling center, right? Is also something that maybe has solar power with a battery backup so that if people lose power, the community center still has power, right? For maybe people's like medications or, things like that. So I think you could have, educational programs at the community center and like daycare, but you could also make it a resiliency hub simultaneously to deal with, things like heat waves, smoke, things like that.
Thanks, Janet. Yeah, I thought that was really interesting from that one too. I'm just looking at the chat. So Alicia says, to piggyback on what Leslie said, individuals with disabilities face some of the same challenges caused by these climate impacts. Evacuating or even just continuing to provide basic daily supports to individuals with disabilities during an emergency situation is complicated. A lot of the people we support are not mobile, and many rely solely on the people who care for them to meet their basic needs and keep them safe. This puts the individuals we support and the staff providing the services at higher risk. Yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, feel free to share in the chat too. I know not everyone likes to speak out loud, so it's great to share in the chat as well. So I just, I want to give anyone else the opportunity. Oh, Mike, yes, I saw your hand.
All right, got it. Yeah, unmute. I'm going to bring up something that the former chair of the Oregon Transportation Commission said when they started looking at the climate approach for the statewide plan, and that is in-migration from other states, like climate refugees. So as other parts of the U.S. have problems with climate impacts, could be the South that gets unbearably too hot, or California or whatever. Oregon may just be impacted by so much migration into the state, people trying to find a better life, less impact, and hopefully Oregon will be less impacted than other areas, because I like Oregon. But that's going to put so much pressure on so many things. The first thing I think about is housing. And we have housing problems right now. So my concern is how that's going to be so much more impacted in the future if we do have so much climate refugees coming into the state. We have these very tight urban growth boundary policies, which are good, but they end up either raising prices or forcing people to move out to the next community and travel in. That's why Salem has so much external traffic, because we have so many people coming from Dallas and Brownsville and Staten coming in because they can't afford to live in Salem, right? But there's also an equity question. There's going to be gentrification. Those homes that seem maybe affordable now and are in some pockets of Salem, well, what's going to happen to them? They're going to be, the prices will go up, or houses will be knocked down for bigger houses. So there's that whole equity thing of gentrification too. So there's so many external forces that could happen just on the housing policy issue. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah. Oh, Casey, did you want to add something on that?
I could add a lot to it, but I'll only add a little to take time. I actually moved here years ago as a preemptive measure from the South to the Pacific Northwest, specifically from climate modeling and other reasons, because I have two very young kids, and 30, 50, 60 years from now, I want them to be in a place that's a little more sustainable. So that's not necessarily what I wanted to say, but just the other issues that are kind of cross-cutting that are concerns of mine from a planning commissioner hat deal with that migration, but also issues such as reduced potential crop yields for our agriculture, the decreased water availability that we might have, and then how that affects specific populations from a water scarcity and supply issue, especially when we have competing interests like agriculture or like fish and wildlife, where we want to protect salmon runs and things like that. But then we also need to supply people with water. So we need to, if we're planning for a climate migration or just growth in general, we have to be very mindful of how we balance all of these needs with potential scarcity in mind in the future, and it becomes a challenge, right? And so my concern is that we take too narrow-minded of an approach from a vision standpoint and a strategy, like long-term strategy, because we want to just get stuff done now, rather than really taking time to consider how we're setting ourselves up for even after I'm gone, and I'm not that old, right? And it's really what we're trying to set up is right now is stuff that's going to really affect things, many decades from now.
Yeah, that's a great point, Casey. And I think climate migration is one of those topics where the sort of cascading effects down the line and really into the future are really hard to comprehend now, as individuals living today, and kind of trying to foresee how that will impact things. But it's really important to keep in mind those things, and the potential impacts, not just for us, but for future generations as well. So I'm maybe some of you are wondering kind of what does this mean? Why is this helpful? But I think the reason it's helpful to start with this kind of high level conversation is to flag these issues, right? And to flag these concerns, because we need to keep them in mind as we move forward, refining our strategies. And just to be transparent, I'm writing down notes to kind of keep in our back pocket and make sure that we're bringing those issues forward as we kind of continue with this process. But in the next few weeks, you all will have a chance to review in detail the list of strategies that Kim was talking about, and that pulls in input from you, from subject matter experts, and from the public as well. And we wanted to provide you an opportunity today to kind of start sharing any concerns that you have at this point about the strategies that we ideated. So thinking back to the last workshop, when we were kind of brainstorming and putting those onto the Miro board, and thinking about what you know about other climate action plans and the strategies that have been implemented. Are there any ideas that have been suggested so far that concern you for the unintended consequences that they might have? So I've heard from a couple concerns from Alex kind of separately outside of these workshops, but I want to open it up to anyone who's kind of thought, hey, what about this? This might be impacted by this strategy that we came up with. How are we going to deal with that? Mike?
Yeah, just kind of a general concern, I think, on some of the housing issues we've talked about as we talk about building codes and the like, definitely have an impact on housing prices, both in terms of affordability, both in purchases and rents, and that will have a disproportionate impact on our lower income populations here in town.
So you're saying building codes, like requiring certain standards in buildings will cause the housing prices to go up. Sorry, I just wanted to clarify what you said.
Sure, just because, you know, the increased energy efficiency that can be gained out of the building code doesn't come cheaply at this point, because we've kind of gotten the low hanging fruit for the most part. And so all of that comes with a cost that has to get passed along in terms of housing price or rent. And of course that will affect, as I said, those, you know, at least able to deal with those increases.
Okay, thank you. Casey, did you have your hand up from before, or were you raising your hand again?
It has not been lowered. I'll lower it.
Okay. Anyone else?
Tom has his hand, flagged.
Oh, Chom.
Thanks. I've been putting it up, and apparently it was clapped, so I don't know if that means people thought I was clapping.
Oh.
A couple things in general. First of all, I've got Kaylee beat by one important fact. I'm a privileged white male, and I don't have any idea of what goes on with people of color, and we need to hear from them as much as we can. The second issue that I look at is, I think, a real equity issue is transportation, and the council looks at that on various ways. And one of the things that has happened is we have been approving various low-income housing projects on the outskirts of the town, and where there's no transportation, public transportation. And in the economic situation, the kind of cars that people who have to rely on are both gas guzzlers, and they're buying them from places where they're usurious interest rates. So it just has this huge economic effect by building out there without transportation. The other thing that was kind of overall to me, I think that due to the makeup of our city, one of the broader equity issue is economic, as opposed to people of color and racial, which is just as important, if not more important. But what I see potentially happening, and I don't know if Verdis knows this, but we're the state capital. So we are subject all the time to white supremacists, to Second Amendment people, to people whose political views in that end, often but not always, are correlated with the views that aren't favorable to minorities and people of color. And so that is going to be something that we're going to have to face as we look at doing more and more economic climate action things to show an equity lens. That's not going to be popular with the same segment who are against Black Lives Matter and other things. And I don't say that's going to stop us, but it's a factor we have to consider. The final thing I'll say is, back to my original point as a privileged white male, you know, it's my kind of people who have, to some extent at least, caused the crisis we're undergoing right now with the greenhouse gas. So it sure seemed to me that we obtain the most benefits, and so any kind of I'll put just quotes, negative impacts, folks like me ought to share more of those than folks who are on the other end of the economic scale.
Thanks, Tom. Jose, I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, thank you. I would say two quick things. I guess that's true since you guys aren't from Salem. What I notice is that a lot of people that talk about Northeast Salem don't spend time there. So it's just that's the biggest issue. Decisions are made, and nobody really has spent the time. And I would say the second thing with regards to housing costs, because I've been in housing in Northeast Salem for 20 plus years, and they also mean the utility costs. So when they mean housing costs, they're talking about the rental rates, possibly the mortgages, but also all the costs associated with being in that house.
That's a great point. Thanks, Jose. Kaylee, did you want to share?
Yeah, I have something that has been on my mind, and I'm not sure I will articulate it very well, but the thing that I've been grappling with is in terms of buy-in from just the general population of Salem. How do we get buy-in for climate action plans and policies when so many of our residents are struggling and they're just in survival mode? So when we talk about in terms of just they're on a daily basis, if we're talking racial, we're talking lack of safety, lack of resources, economic issues. How do we gain buy-in when that's not something that they're talking, worried about necessarily? They've got a lot more things on their plate than worrying about, a tax or anything like that. So that's just something that's been on my mind. I don't know how to address it, or if this is the appropriate place to address it, but I work a lot in education, and that is something that constantly comes up is the prioritization of some of these topics.
Absolutely, Kaylee, and that's kind of that's an issue that comes up right in these kinds of conversations all the time. It comes up when you're talking about public engagement. It's how do you ask people to share their time on this topic when there are just a lot of other things that people are balancing in their lives. And I don't have all the answers, right? I don't know. But that's why we talk about these things. That's why we work towards representation and public engagement. That's why we kind of draw on the expertise of folks who know what they're talking about, right? And I think that's something that we need to revisit throughout this process. So thank you for bringing that up. John, did you want to?
I just want to follow on Kaylee's point of, I was just at a meeting with a number of individuals from other cities and counties. Multnomah County is taking 2 years in a comprehensive outreach to deal with its climate plan. I mean, I was very impressed of their process of what they're going to do to make sure every community member is engaged and has a say in what they're doing. And they're taking a full 2 years.
Thanks for sharing that, John. That's great. We need robust engagement like that, right? That's the ideal. Janet, you had your hand up. Did you want to share?
Yeah, I had a quick question, which is who's doing the GIS map and who should I email about the Oregon Environmental Justice Task Force, who recommends specific equity measures be included in climate equity plans?
I believe that's Rob. Is that correct, Kim?
Yes, Rob is heading up Rob Romanek is heading up the GIS mapping, but you can certainly send anything to me and to Patricia, Janet.
Okay. I did want to mention that, the definition of equity is that, the benefits are not just kind of spread over equally, right? Mm-hmm. But it's kind of, the benefits are based on need. So ideally, if we kind of walk the walk in terms of aiming benefits where the need is greatest, that there would be some buy-in if there would be trust that we would follow through on that.
Thanks, Janet. That's actually a great transition into the next thing that I was going to talk about, which is, and we only have a few minutes left. So kind of sharing with you all sort of the approach to equity that we are taking thus far, and, kind of getting your feedback on that briefly. So a lot of you have mentioned kind of this idea of representation and making sure that all of the right voices are included in these conversations as we move through the development of the climate action plan and not just later down the line. So, as you know, this task force was kind of carefully formed with the intention of having a diverse range of perspectives deeply involved in this sort of climate action or planning process. And, public engagement efforts are being evaluated to ensure that opportunities for input are accessible to all, and that we're hearing from everyone in the community, and we're trying to kind of adapt and see how we can use some new strategies going forward, especially with regard to sharing the draft climate action plan with folks and getting feedback from all different parts of the community. So there's that process piece, which it's not perfect, and we're trying to work, to make it better. So there's that piece. There's the strategy piece. So equity is woven in throughout the strategies themselves. You'll see this when you take a look at the list. So for example, one of the transportation strategies is complete Salem sidewalk network throughout the city with a priority emphasis on areas within a half mile of a transit route and areas such as Northeast Salem that have been historically neglected. So you can see how that piece related to prioritizing certain neighborhoods and things like that is built into that specific strategy. And then kind of one level up from that, for each action area, we are developing guiding equity principles. So we heard from you that you kind of see equity as like an overarching strategy, as well as it should be embedded within the strategy. So for example, for transportation, again, the guiding equity principle that we have kind of drafted right now is, and this kind of pulls from things that you all have shared and public input and things like that. So the guiding equity principle that we have for transportation right now is to prioritize actions and allocation of public funding that improve safe mobility and increase transportation choice in low-income neighborhoods, and then to intentionally engage residents in low-income neighborhoods during planning and decision-making phases to better understand the needs and priorities of specific areas. And so these are kind of draft, right? But we're trying to make sure that that principle kind of has the like fall effects on the strategies, and keep those things in mind as we create and refine these strategies. And then the last piece is implementation. So we added a strategy that recommends that the city create an equity task force or a working group that ensures that implementation of the climate action plan strategies down the line are in fact equitable. So making sure that these certain areas are prioritized or whatever that may be, kind of as a way to hold ourselves accountable. Sorry, we're going over a little bit, Kim, but I just wanted to open it up really quick. Does anyone have any really brief feedback on that so far, or you can share that with me later via email? Any thoughts on kind of that approach? Benny? Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
No, thank you. What your comments that you just shared brings back to what we need to be, and that is, when we look at this task force right now, everybody that's in this room, virtual room, is of age. We don't have any young people weighing in on any impacts that they feel or sense will be felt by them. But as long as we're having, and on the heels of what you just said, a format, or no, I won't say a format, a structure where equity is going to be talked about, is going to be embedded, is going to be shared, is going to be seeking additional input all along the way, that's a good thing.
Thanks, Benny. Yeah, that's actually a really good point about involving youth. I know we have Alex on the task force from Latinos Unidos Siempre, and that's, I think students, but yeah, it's a great point. So we're about 3 minutes from the end, so I want to wrap up this conversation and just kind of let you know where we're headed from here. So like I said, you all will be looking at this list of strategies, and we're going to ask you to kind of take what we're talking about with regard to equity and really think critically about those strategies, and think about the impacts they would have, and think about how we could refine them to make them more equitable, to have co-benefits for communities of color, for low-income communities, for people living with disabilities, and on and on. So Kim, I want to pass it back to you to kind of wrap up and talk a little bit more about strategy development, but I just want to make sure that everyone knows that we're not just leaving this conversation open. We're taking into account everything that you're saying.
Yes, thank you so much, Kate, and thank you all. That was a really rich conversation, and we're very grateful for it. Just to wrap up here, I wanted to reiterate that we have a survey coming your way next week, which will ask for your reactions to a full strategy list. So be on the lookout for that. We look forward to getting your feedback. And then in terms of our next meetings, we have reorganized things a little bit in terms of how the next meetings play out. So we have we have one date change and one additional meeting, which I hope will be okay with you all. We have scheduled an additional meeting on Wednesday, April 7th from 9 to noon, and I'll email you about this, so don't worry about it. But at that meeting, we would like to discuss your responses to the strategy list. And we will also pick up this discussion about equity, and that will probably be woven together. So once you've had a chance to see the strategies, we'll talk about that. And then we will also have time to talk about the cost benefit analysis that's going to be done. And you can see, you'll hear from our economists and see an example of how they're going to do the cost benefit analysis. And then the 5th workshop will be, the date changed on that. It was originally in July. It's now going to be June 23rd from 9 a.m. to noon. And at that time, that will be a time when we will be doing implementation planning. So talking about how we're actually going to implement these strategies, who are the community partners, what's the timeline, et cetera. And then the final meeting will be in October, Tuesday, October 5th. That'll just be a 1-hour short meeting. And that is right before we launch the draft climate action plan to the public. And so we just want to have sort of a launch party with all of you who worked so hard to create it. And at that point, we will be asking you to help share it with your networks. As Kate just mentioned, you all were specifically chosen to represent certain communities on this task force. And so we would ask you, especially during that public engagement period when the draft plan is circulating, we'd like you to share it with your communities as much as possible so we can make sure to get a wide variety of feedback on the plan. So again, I will follow up on those dates via email so you can get them in your calendar. But we will plan on seeing you again, hopefully, if you can make it, on April 7th. So thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you all.